There's something strange about the way history remembers. Sometimes it forgets the loudest truths and remembers only the ones written down. But what if the real story was never written at all? What if there are entire civilizations that left behind no scrolls, no tablets, no carved laws, but built towers taller than trees and shaped the land so perfectly their monuments still move with the moon? Not one of them left a single word, but they left maps you can only see from the sky. They left statues that still watch. The question is, were they forgotten, or did someone choose not to remember them? Today we're visiting these lost civilizations, the ones that never wrote books but built wonders we still can't explain. If you're listening and something about this already feels off, like a page missing from a book you thought you finished, hit subscribe. We're only starting to hear them. The morning light hits the stone at exactly the right angle, and for a moment it looks like it was never cut at all. Like it simply emerged from the earth that way. Perfect, seamless, waiting. You're standing nearly 13,000 feet above sea level on the Altiplano of Bolivia, where the air is so thin your lungs work overtime just to think clearly. The wind carries no scent of trees or grass, only the cold bite of altitude and something else, something that feels older than the mountains themselves. Before you lies Pumapunku, and its stones tell a story no one knows how to read. The blocks are massive, some weighing over 100 tons, yet they fit together like puzzle pieces designed by a mind that understood geometry better than we do today. The cuts are so precise that modern engineers struggle to explain how they were made. No gaps, no mortar, no visible tool marks, just stone against stone, so perfectly aligned that you can't slide a credit card between them. The local Aymara people have a word for this place. Pumapunku means gate of the puma. But if it's a gate, no one remembers what it opened to. And if it honored the puma, no one recalls why. What strikes you first isn't the size of the stones, it's their silence. This isn't where you'd expect to find one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations. The Altiplano is harsh, unforgiving, a place where crops freeze in summer and the sun burns your skin while the wind chills your bones. Yet here, between 400 and 1000 CE, a people built something extraordinary. They engineered raised fields that turned barren land into productive farmland, creating a microclimate that protected crops from frost. They carved channels that directed water with mathematical precision. They aligned their temples to track the movement of stars with an accuracy that rivals modern observatories. They built pyramids that dwarf many Egyptian monuments, and they did it all without leaving a single word of explanation. No inscriptions, no hieroglyphs, no clay tablets recording the name of a king or the date of a conquest. In a world where every other major civilization felt compelled to announce itself, to carve names into stone and paint victories on walls, Tiwanaku chose silence. The absence feels deliberate. Walk through Pumapunku today and you'll find H-shaped blocks carved from red sandstone and andesite, each one unique yet perfectly fitted to its neighbors. Some have channels cut through them with laser-like precision. Others have holes drilled in perfect patterns as if following a blueprint that no longer exists. The nearest quarry that could produce stones of this quality lies more than 50 kilometers away. Moving a 100-ton block that distance across rivers and up mountain slopes would challenge modern machinery. Yet somehow they brought dozens of these megalithic pieces to Pumapunku and placed them with millimeter accuracy. The conventional explanation involves ramps, rollers, and thousands of workers, but no ancient civilization documented such an undertaking. No songs survive celebrating the great stone moving. No pottery depicts the massive construction projects. It's as if the builders wanted their methods to disappear along with them. Alternative theories get more creative. Some researchers suggest the stones were softened using plant acids, making them temporarily malleable. Others propose acoustic levitation, the idea that sound waves could lift massive weights. A few have even suggested that the builders possessed metallurgy far beyond what we've found evidence for, allowing them to cut stone with tools that have since corroded away. But here's what's truly puzzling. Why go to such extraordinary lengths to build something, then refuse to explain how or why? Most ancient civilizations left traces of their daily lives. Mesopotamians kept business records. Egyptians painted tomb walls with scenes of harvest and celebration. The Maya carved historical chronicles into stone. But Tiwanaku is different. It's a civilization that seems to have methodically erased its own voice. You find no royal tombs filled with treasures and inscriptions, no temples covered in creation myths, no domestic artifacts that tell stories of family life. What you find instead are structures that seem designed to interact with forces beyond human society, with the sun, the stars, the cycles of the earth itself. The famous Kalasasaya temple is aligned to track the spring equinox. The Akapana pyramid channels rainwater through its interior in patterns that mirror the constellation of the Southern Cross. The Sun Gate, a massive carved doorway that stands alone in the ruins, frames the rising sun on the winter solstice. These aren't random architectural choices, they're evidence of a civilization that understood astronomy, hydrology, and sacred geometry at a level that rivals any ancient culture. Yet they chose to communicate their knowledge through stone and silence, not through words. When the Inca Empire expanded into the Tiwanaku region centuries later, they found the ruins already ancient. But instead of claiming the city as their own, as conquerors typically do, they treated it as a holy site belonging to an earlier age. Inca legends speak of Tiwanaku as the place where the creator god, Viracocha, first brought light to the world. They believed the stones were set in place by giants who lived before the sun rose. They maintained the site as a pilgrimage destination, but they never claimed to have built it. This reverence is telling. The Inca were master builders themselves, creators of Machu Picchu and the road system that connected their empire. They understood stone construction better than almost any civilization in history. Yet when they looked at Tiwanaku, they saw something beyond their capabilities. Even more intriguing, the Inca had a sophisticated system of record-keeping using knotted strings called quipu. They could have documented Tiwanaku's history, recorded its builders, preserved its purpose. Instead, they wrapped it in myth and left it mysterious. At the heart of Pumapunku stands perhaps the most enigmatic structure of all, a doorway carved from a single block of andesite. It's called the Gate of the Sun, and it's covered in intricate carvings that seem to depict a central figure surrounded by winged beings and geometric patterns. But this gate leads nowhere. It doesn't connect to any building. It doesn't mark the entrance to a sacred space. It simply stands, framing nothing but sky and distant mountains. The carvings are crisp, detailed, clearly important. They suggest a complex mythology, a sophisticated understanding of symbolic representation. Yet without written records, we can only guess at their meaning. The central figure might be Viracocha, the creator god. The winged beings might represent messengers or priests. The geometric patterns might be a calendar, a star map, or a coded message, or they might be something else entirely. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that Tiwanaku's builders didn't fail to leave records. They chose a different medium. Maybe they believed that words were too fragile, too easily misunderstood, too vulnerable to the corruption of time. Maybe they trusted stone to carry their message across millennia in ways that writing never could. The precision of their cuts, the astronomical alignments, the mathematical relationships between structures, these might be their literature. The way shadows move across carved surfaces, the way water flows through engineered channels, the way the stones frame celestial events. These might be their poetry. If so, then Tiwanaku isn't silent at all. It's speaking in a language we've forgotten how to hear. Today, Tiwanaku sits under the vast Bolivian sky, its stones still fitted together with impossible precision. Archaeologists continue to uncover new structures, new alignments, new evidence of sophisticated engineering, but the deeper questions remain unanswered. Who were the builders? How did they move the stones? Why did they choose this harsh landscape for their masterpiece? And most puzzling of all, why did they refuse to explain themselves? Standing among the ruins, you begin to understand that perhaps the mystery was intentional. Perhaps the builders of Tiwanaku understood something about permanence that we've forgotten. Words can be mistranslated, twisted, lost. But stone endures, and mystery, it seems, has its own power. The gate of the sun still stands, still frames the sky, still keeps its secrets, and maybe that's exactly what its builders intended. They built with stone, they didn't write, and in their silence, they've spoken louder than any civilization that carved its stories into history books. But what were they trying to say? And why did they trust us to figure it out? The wind picks up across the Altiplano, carrying dust from stones that have waited 1,000 years for someone to ask the right questions. But first, you have to wonder, what if the silence wasn't accidental? What if it was the whole point? From the wind-swept plateaus of Bolivia, where ancient stones still hold their secrets in perfect silence, we now journey north to a very different landscape. Here, beneath the vast skies of the American Midwest, the earth itself was shaped into monuments that few people recognize as such. The moon rises over Illinois farmland, casting long shadows across what looks like rolling hills. But these aren't natural hills, they're too perfectly shaped, too deliberately placed. In the silvery light, you can almost see the ghosts of the people who built them, carrying basket after basket of earth, grain by grain, building a city that would rise and fall in perfect silence. This is Cahokia, though that name came later, borrowed from a tribe that never lived here. In the year 1100 CE, this was the largest city north of Mexico, home to perhaps 20,000 people. It rivaled the great cities of Europe, as populous as London, more sophisticated than most settlements the continent had ever seen. And yet walk through it today and you'll find no inscriptions, no monuments declaring the names of kings, no written records explaining how or why it came to be. Just earthen mounds rising from the prairie like ancient thoughts made manifest. The centerpiece towers above everything else, Monk's Mound, a massive artificial mountain that took an estimated 14 million baskets of soil to construct. It's taller than a 10-story building and covers 14 acres at its base. Standing on top, you can see for miles across the floodplain of the Mississippi River, a vista that once encompassed the most complex urban center in prehistoric North America. The builders didn't choose this spot randomly. They understood something about this landscape that we're only beginning to rediscover. The base of Monk's Mound aligns almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, but not quite. The orientation shifts by just a few degrees, precisely the amount needed to track the complex dance of lunar cycles across the sky. This wasn't accidental. The entire city was designed as a massive observatory, a place where human society synchronized itself with the rhythm of celestial bodies. Just west of the Great Mound stood a circle of wooden posts now called Woodhenge by archaeologists who recognized its similarity to Stonehenge. But this wasn't built of stone. It was carved from massive red cedar timbers, each post carefully positioned to mark the rising and setting of the sun and moon at crucial moments in the year. As these celestial bodies appeared between specific posts, the entire city would respond, markets would open, ceremonies would begin, and sometimes blood would be spilled, because Cahokia wasn't just a city, it was a ritual machine calibrated to the sky. The evidence lies buried beneath a smaller mound designated Mound 72 by archaeologists. What they found there in the 1960s changed everything we thought we knew about prehistoric North America. Beneath tons of carefully placed earth lay a mass burial unlike anything discovered before or since. The central figure was a man in his 40s, laid to rest on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird or falcon. Around him, the archaeologists found the remains of nearly 300 other individuals, mostly young women, many showing no signs of struggle or violence. They died willingly, it seems, following some ritual logic that no written record explains. The timing appears to have been crucial. Isotope analysis suggests the burials occurred during specific lunar phases, when the moon's position triggered ceremonies that the living understood but never felt compelled to document. The central figure, dubbed the Birdman by researchers, was buried with symbols of power, copper sheets, mica ornaments, and artifacts that suggest he was more than a simple ruler. He was a priest-king, a human intermediary between the earthly city and the celestial forces that governed it. But we don't know his name. We don't know his lineage. We don't know the prayers spoken over his grave or the songs sung during the ceremonies that marked his reign. All we have are the silent artifacts and the testimony of bones and earth. This absence of writing feels deliberate. The Mississippian culture that built Cahokia was sophisticated enough to create complex urban planning, advanced agricultural systems, and precise astronomical observations. They traded with peoples across the continent, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Their artisans produced intricate pottery, elaborate copperwork, and textiles that would have rivaled anything produced in medieval Europe. They understood mathematics well enough to construct earthworks with geometric precision that still impresses modern engineers. Yet they chose not to write. Or perhaps they wrote in a medium we don't recognize, in the placement of mounds, the alignment of plazas, the careful choreography of seasonal ceremonies. Maybe the entire city was their text, and we're still learning to read it. The symbols that do survive are tantalizing but incomplete. Pottery sherds bear stylized images of birds, serpents, and human figures engaged in what appear to be ritual activities. Stone tablets show elaborate geometric patterns that might represent star charts or ceremonial instructions. But without a Rosetta Stone, without oral traditions that survived the centuries, these images remain locked in mystery. What we do know is that Cahokia's influence extended far beyond its earthen walls. The Mississippian culture spread across the southeastern United States, creating a network of chiefdoms and ceremonial centers that shared similar architectural styles, burial practices, and iconographic traditions. They built mounds in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and beyond, each one oriented to capture the light of sun and moon at significant moments in the year. This wasn't a military empire held together by conquest and tribute. It was something more subtle, a cultural movement, a shared vision of how human society should align itself with cosmic forces. The moon was their metronome, the sun their conductor, and the stars their sheet music. But the composer remains anonymous. Around 1350 CE, something changed. The great city began to empty, not all at once, but gradually, like a slow exhale. There are no signs of warfare, no evidence of invasion or conquest. The mounds weren't destroyed, they were simply abandoned. The wood-henge posts rotted away. The plazas fell silent. The ritual calendar that had governed life for centuries stopped turning. Why? Climate change might have played a role. The period coincides with a cooling trend that could have disrupted agriculture. Social tensions might have built up as population pressures strained resources. Or perhaps the religious system that held everything together simply lost its power to inspire. Without written records, we can only guess at the forces that led an entire civilization to walk away from the most sophisticated urban center in North America. But the most haunting possibility is that the abandonment was itself a ritual act, that the builders of Cahokia understood something about permanence and impermanence that we've forgotten. They built a city designed to last forever, then chose to let it fade back into the earth. They created a calendar that would outlive them, then stopped reading it. They aligned their lives with eternal cycles, then stepped out of time. Today, Cahokia sits beside Interstate 55, a few miles from downtown St. Louis. Monk's Mound still rises above the surrounding farmland, but most visitors drive past without stopping. The woodhenge has been reconstructed based on archaeological evidence, its posts marking the same celestial events they tracked 1,000 years ago. But no crowds gather for the solstices. No ceremonies mark the lunar phases. The ritual machine runs empty. Yet the moon still rises over the mounds, casting the same shadows that once triggered prayers and sacrifices. The sun still tracks its predictable path across the sky. The stars still wheel in their ancient patterns. And somewhere in the accumulated earth of Cahokia, the bones of the birdman still lie on their bed of shell beads, waiting for someone to remember the song that once made the whole world dance. The silence isn't empty. It's full of questions that echo across the centuries. What kind of civilization builds a calendar they never write down? What kind of ruler never carves his name in stone? And if the moon was their clock, marking time for rituals we can't translate, then who was it counting down for? Standing on Monk's Mound as the moon rises, you might find yourself wondering if the ritual ever really ended. If somewhere in the movement of shadows and the turning of seasons, the ceremony continues, wordless, precise, waiting for someone to remember how to read the sky, because maybe that's what the builders of Cahokia understood that we've forgotten. That the most important stories don't need words. They need time and patience, and the willingness to let the earth and sky do the talking. The moon watches, the mounds remember, and the silence speaks louder than any inscription ever could. While the people of Cahokia were building their earthen observatories in the American heartland, far to the south, in the steaming jungles of Mesoamerica, another civilization was carving something far more enigmatic into history. But where Cahokia left patterns in earth, these people left faces in stone, massive, haunting, and utterly without explanation. The face emerges from the earth like a half-remembered dream. Carved from basalt, smoothed by centuries of rain and wind, it stares skyward with an expression that seems both serene and eternally watchful. The nose is broad, the lips heavy, the eyes calm but unreadable. There is no writing on the stone, no plaque, no hint of who this might have been or why someone spent months carving their likeness into 50 tons of volcanic rock. Only the jungle remembers where he lay buried, and the jungle doesn't speak in words. This is one of 17 colossal heads discovered so far across the humid lowlands of southern Mexico, each one different, each one massive enough to crush a car. They were dragged from quarries over 90 kilometers away, shaped with stone tools and wooden hammers, and set upright as if guarding something sacred, or mourning something lost. The effort required to create just one would have occupied entire communities for years. Yet no one knows their names, no one ever wrote them down. And maybe that was the point, Before the Maya built their towering pyramids, before the Aztec ruled the Valley of Mexico, before Tenochtitlan rose from the lake, there were the Olmec. They were the first in Mesoamerica to raise monumental architecture, to organize ceremonial cities, to carve divine faces into stone. They invented the sacred ball game that would echo through centuries of later cultures. They developed complex calendars that tracked the movements of Venus and the moon. They created gods with jaguar faces and human hearts, deities that would be worshipped long after their creators were forgotten. Archaeologists call them the mother civilization, the root system beneath all the great empires that followed. But roots grow in darkness, and the Olmec are known more for what others borrowed from them than for what they left behind, in their own words. They created the template for Mesoamerican civilization, then stepped back into silence. The mystery deepens when you consider what they accomplished without leaving instructions. At San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, massive earthworks were aligned with celestial events, with a precision that suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Recent LiDAR scans have revealed planned urban centers beneath the rainforest canopy, plazas, water channels, raised platforms, drainage systems that would shame modern engineering. There are altars carved in the shape of caves, tombs filled with jade offerings, thrones that show figures emerging from sacred clefts as if being born from the earth itself. These weren't random acts of artistic inspiration. They were part of a complex symbolic system, a way of understanding the world that was sophisticated enough to influence cultures for over 1,000 years. The Maya adopted Olmec calendar systems. The Zapotecs used their iconography. Aztec priests claimed Olmec ruins as ancestral temples, but the Olmec themselves left no voice behind, no explanation of what it all meant. There is one artifact that might change that understanding. It's called the Cascajal block, a slab of serpentinite covered in strange, repeating glyphs found not far from the Gulf Coast in the heart of Olmec territory. At first glance, it seems like a written script, possibly the earliest in the Americas. The symbols are organized in rows, some repeating, others unique, arranged in patterns that suggest syntax and meaning. But even this tantalizing glimpse into Olmec thought remains locked in mystery. Some scholars argue it represents the first true writing system in the Americas, predating Maya hieroglyphs by centuries. Others dismiss it as decorative patterns or even question its authenticity. Without another block like it, without a corpus of similar texts, the symbols remain as mute as the stone heads. The Olmec speak in fragments, symbols that may have had meaning once, but meaning decays without memory, without the continuity of written tradition. This absence of readable text becomes more puzzling when you consider the sophistication of Olmec society. They weren't a simple tribal culture scratching out subsistence in the jungle. They were urban planners, hydraulic engineers, long-distance traders who moved goods across thousands of kilometers. They worked jade into intricate masks and ceremonial axes. They understood metallurgy well enough to create mirrors from iron ore. They built ceremonial centers that could accommodate thousands of people for religious festivals and political gatherings. Yet they chose not to write, or if they did write, they chose not to preserve it in forms that would survive. This decision, and it does feel like a decision, sets them apart from almost every other complex civilization in human history. The Sumerians felt compelled to record their business transactions. The Egyptians covered tomb walls with instructions for the afterlife. The Maya carved their genealogies into stone. But the Olmec remained silent, speaking only through symbol and image, leaving their thoughts locked in basalt and jade. The colossal heads embody this paradox perfectly. Each one is distinct, wide-cheeked, furrowed, wearing what might be a helmet or crown. Some look stern, others tired, a few almost melancholy. They were clearly meant to be portraits, not generic representations. The sculptors paid careful attention to individual features, to the specific weight of cheekbones, the particular curve of lips. These were real people, commemorated with a level of care and skill that suggests they were important, powerful, worth remembering. But we don't know if they were kings, priests, warriors, or athletes. We don't know their names, their deeds, their relationships to each other. We don't know if they ruled in sequence or simultaneously, if they were allies or enemies, if they lived in the same generation or across centuries. Maybe the heads speak of a sophisticated understanding of portraiture, of political power, of the human desire to be remembered. But they do so without words, without context, without the narrative framework that would make their stories accessible to us. This silence becomes even more intriguing when you consider that the Olmec didn't vanish in fire or war. There are no signs of massive destruction, no evidence of conquest or collapse. Instead, they seem to have been absorbed into other cultures, other beliefs, other ways of understanding the world. Their influence spread across Mesoamerica like seeds on the wind, taking root in Maya temples and Aztec rituals. But the original tree disappeared. Perhaps this was intentional. Perhaps the Olmec understood something about permanence and impermanence that we've forgotten. Words can be mistranslated, twisted, lost. But images, symbols, faces carved in stone, these speak in a language that transcends the rise and fall of empires. A face needs no translation. A jaguar god carved in jade speaks to something deeper than politics or history. Standing before one of these massive heads, you begin to understand that maybe the mystery was the message. Maybe the builders of these monuments understood that the most profound truths can't be written down, only experienced. Maybe they trusted future generations to feel what they felt when they looked at these faces, to understand through empathy what couldn't be captured in words. The jungle continues to give up its secrets slowly. New sites are discovered regularly, new artifacts that hint at the complexity of Olmec civilization. But with each discovery, the central mystery deepens. How do you build a civilization that influences the world for millennia, then disappear without explaining yourself? How do you create art so powerful that it moves people across cultures and centuries, yet never sign your name? There is one face recently discovered, still half buried near the modern town of La Venta. The soil grips its lower half like a blanket, but the eyes remain exposed, staring up at the sky with that same calm, unreadable expression. It feels like it's watching the modern world pass by, cars and trucks and tourists with cameras, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Maybe it wasn't silence after all, maybe it was a kind of wisdom. What if the Olmec knew that the only way to be truly remembered was to be seen, not heard? What if they understood that mystery has more power than explanation, that questions last longer than answers? The face in the earth continues to wait, patient as stone, holding its secrets behind lips that will never speak. And perhaps that's exactly what its creators intended. They built monuments to endure, not to explain. They carved faces to be remembered, not to be understood. And in their silence, they've spoken louder than any civilization that carved its stories into history books. But what were they really trying to say? And why did they trust us to figure it out without words? The archaeologist's brush reveals another mark in the clay, and for a moment, the world tilts. It's just a simple stroke, a triangle followed by a cross, then 3 parallel lines drawn with unmistakable intention. But this fragment was pulled from Neolithic earth in Serbia, buried for more than 7,000 years. It's older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the earliest tablets from Sumer that we've always been told represent humanity's first attempt at writing. And it's not alone. Across the Balkans, in Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, hundreds of these symbols have been found etched into pottery shards, carved into figurines, scratched onto spindle whorls. They appear with a consistency that suggests meaning arranged in patterns that hint at structure. Some signs appear more frequently than others, some are always grouped together, and a few, like a distinctive tilted cross, show up so often across different sites that researchers suspect they carried shared meaning across the entire Vinca world. The people who made them were part of what archaeologists call the Vinca culture, a network of Neolithic settlements that flourished along the Danube River between roughly 6000 and 3000 BCE. This wasn't the scattered, primitive world we typically imagine for the Neolithic period. Some settlements, like Vinca Beloburdo, near modern Belgrade, were home to thousands of people living in rectangular houses arranged in neat rows. They farmed wheat and barley, kept domesticated animals, and fired pottery in sophisticated kilns. There were trade networks that moved goods across hundreds of kilometers, shared artistic motifs, and evidence of social organization that rivals anything found in contemporary Mesopotamia. But they had something else, something that doesn't fit the neat timeline of human development that fills our textbooks. They had a symbol system that looked suspiciously like writing, created millennia before writing was supposed to exist. The symbols themselves are deceptively simple. Crosses, triangles, zigzags, parallel lines, abstract glyphs that seem to follow their own internal logic. They're always short, always isolated, no lengthy inscriptions, no narrative tablets, no evidence of a fully developed grammar. But they're also clearly intentional. Some are scratched into freshly fired pottery, a difficult process with no ornamental value. Others appear in meaningful positions, on thresholds, in burial goods, on objects that suggest ritual or administrative use. The academic world has never quite known what to do with the Vinca symbols. Writing, as we're taught, began in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE with cuneiform. Then Egypt developed hieroglyphs. Then the Indus Valley created its still undeciphered script. This represents a clear ladder of civilized development, a progression from simple to complex that fits our understanding of how human societies evolve. But the Vinca signs date back thousands of years earlier, and they don't fit the ladder. So most textbooks don't mention them. Or if they do, they're dismissed as pre-writing, proto-script, or decorative marks. The implication is clear. These can't be real writing because real writing wasn't invented yet. The logic is circular, but it's also revealing. It suggests that we're more comfortable with mystery than with evidence that challenges our assumptions about the past. But what if the Vinca people were writing? What if they developed a system of symbolic communication that we simply don't recognize because it doesn't look like what we expect writing to look like? The same core set of 30 to 40 signs appears across multiple sites spanning centuries. They show up on different types of objects in different contexts, but always with the same basic forms. This consistency suggests that whatever these symbols meant, the meaning was shared across the Vinca world. The mystery deepens when you consider that the Vinca culture wasn't just advanced in symbolic representation, they were pioneers in other technologies as well. They were among the first Europeans to work with copper, creating tools and ornaments that wouldn't become common elsewhere for centuries. They built multi-story houses with sophisticated drainage systems. They created fired clay figurines with an artistic sophistication that rivals anything produced in the ancient world. These weren't simple farmers scratching marks into clay pots. They were innovators, experimenters, people who were clearly capable of developing complex systems of thought and communication. Yet for all their achievements, the Vinca people have largely been written out of the story of human development. Their settlements are too early, their symbols too ambiguous, their culture too inconvenient for the narratives we've constructed about the rise of civilization. They represent a road not taken, a possibility that was explored and then abandoned, leaving only fragments for us to puzzle over. And then, around 3000 BCE, something changes. The symbols begin to disappear from the archaeological record. The settlements shrink. The trade networks that connected the Vinca world start to fragment. There's no evidence of war, no clear catastrophe, no invading armies. Just a gradual fading, as if an entire way of life was slowly being forgotten. Some archaeologists suggest that the Vinca culture was absorbed by Indo-European migrations, that their symbols were simply replaced by other forms of communication. Others argue that they evolved into different cultural forms, that the Vinca people didn't disappear, but transformed into something else. But the symbols themselves vanish without a trace. No later culture references them, no one copies them. They weren't even rediscovered until the 20th century, when archaeologists began systematically excavating Neolithic sites in the Balkans. This disappearance is almost as puzzling as the symbols themselves. If the Vinca people had developed an effective system of communication, why didn't it spread? Why didn't it influence the writing systems that emerged later in Mesopotamia and Egypt? Why was it allowed to fade away without leaving a mark on human history? One possibility is that the Vinca symbols represent something different from what we normally think of as writing. Perhaps they weren't meant to record language in the way that cuneiform or hieroglyphs do. Maybe they were markers of identity, clan signs, or ritual symbols that carried meaning within specific communities but weren't designed to communicate across cultural boundaries. Or maybe they were a form of proto-writing, an early experiment in symbolic communication that was abandoned before it could fully develop. But there's another possibility, one that's more unsettling. What if the Vinca symbols do represent real writing, and we've simply chosen not to recognize them because they don't fit our preconceptions about how and when writing should have emerged? What if we've been so invested in the idea that civilization began in Mesopotamia that we've overlooked evidence of earlier developments elsewhere? The fragments remain, still pressed into clay, still visible after 7,000 years. They're scattered across museum collections and archaeological reports, studied by a small community of specialists who continue to debate their meaning. Some researchers have attempted to decode them, looking for patterns that might reveal their purpose. Others have dismissed them as meaningless marks, decorative elements that only look like writing to modern eyes trained to see symbols everywhere. But standing in the quiet halls of the National Museum in Belgrade, looking at case after case of pottery shards marked with these mysterious symbols, you can't help but feel that something important has been lost. These aren't random scratches or artistic flourishes. They're the work of minds that were trying to capture something, to preserve it, to pass it on. They represent an attempt to bridge the gap between thought and permanence, between the fleeting moment and the enduring record. Maybe that's what makes the Vinca symbols so haunting. They feel like the beginning of a conversation that was never finished, like the first words of a story that was abandoned before it could be told. They suggest that the human impulse to record, to remember, to communicate across time and space emerged much earlier than we thought. But they also remind us how fragile these early experiments were, how easily they could be lost or forgotten. The symbols wait in their glass cases, patient as the clay that holds them. They've survived floods and fires, wars and migrations, the rise and fall of empires. They've outlasted the people who made them, the communities that understood them, the cultures that might have translated them. And in their silence, they ask questions that we're still struggling to answer. What if someone once tried to describe the world, its animals, its fears, its seasons, its stars, but stopped after the first page? What if the earliest sentence in human history was never finished? What if the Vinca people stood at the threshold of recorded history, looked into the future, and decided to step back into the shadows? The marks remain, scratched into clay, waiting for someone to complete the thought that began 7,000 years ago. But first, we have to decide whether we're ready to hear what they might have been trying to say. High in the Andes, where the mist never clears and the air grows thin enough to touch the sky, another mystery waits among peaks so remote that the outside world barely knew they existed. Here, in the cloud forests of Peru, the Spanish conquistadors would encounter something that defied every assumption they held about the New World. The tomb faces the void, neither welcoming nor forbidding, just watching. It's perched on a cliff face so steep that even looking at it makes your stomach tighten. The sarcophagus is sculpted from clay and painted in ochre and white, shaped like a human sentinel with arms crossed, staring out across the cloud-choked valleys of the Andes. There are no ladders leading to it, no doors opening behind it, no obvious way that human hands could have placed it there. Just silence, stone, and sky. Most travelers never see these tombs. They're too high, too remote, too carefully hidden in the vertical world of the cloud forest. And maybe that was always the point. The Chachapoya didn't build monuments to be admired by passers-by. They built them to endure far above the reach of time, conquest, or even curiosity. But even now, after centuries of abandonment, those painted eyes still watch. And we don't know what they saw. The Inca called them the Cloud People, not as poetry, but as geography. The Chachapoya lived high in the mountains of northern Peru, where the mist never clears and everything climbs. They built their settlements on ridges that seemed to float between earth and sky, in a landscape so vertical that the very act of living there was a kind of defiance. They were known as fierce, hard to conquer, and harder still to fully erase. But almost everything we know about them comes from those who destroyed them. The Inca, expanding their empire southward in the 15th century, encountered the Chachapoya and found them unlike any other culture they had absorbed. These were people who had adapted to impossible terrain, who built circular stone houses without mortar, who created agricultural terraces that clung to cliff faces like green steps to heaven. They were skilled warriors, but more than that, they were skilled at being unreachable. When the Inca finally conquered them, it wasn't through a single great battle, but through a slow, methodical process of absorption that took decades. Later, Spanish chroniclers described the Chachapoya as tall, pale-skinned, and noble, though most of these descriptions were filtered through European preconceptions about what civilized people should look like. The Spanish were fascinated by their architecture, intimidated by their mountain strongholds, and frustrated by their resistance to conversion. But like the Inca before them, they described the Chachapoya from the outside, through the lens of conquest and colonization. The Chachapoya themselves left no written language behind, no alphabet, no scrolls, no clay tablets, no system of knots like the Inca quipu. Their thoughts, their laws, their stories, their names for the mountains and rivers and spirits of their world, all of it existed only in spoken form, carried in memory, and passed down through generations until the generations themselves were scattered or silenced. What they did leave behind speaks in stone and placement, in the vertical architecture of a people who built upward instead of outward, as if seeking proximity to something not entirely of this earth. Their most famous stronghold, Quelap, rises from the mist like a place half remembered from a dream. Over 400 circular buildings cluster inside a massive stone enclosure that stretches 600 meters long, with walls reaching 19 meters high. But even Quelap has no inscriptions, no dedications, no carved names. It simply exists, built for a rhythm that the earth no longer hears. The design is distinctly Chachapoya, circular rather than rectangular, organic rather than geometric. The walls are made of carefully fitted limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, assembled without mortar into structures that have withstood centuries of earthquakes, weather, and neglect. The entire complex is oriented toward the cardinal directions, but also toward specific peaks and valleys that may have held spiritual significance. It's architecture that serves both practical and sacred purposes, built by people who understood that the line between the two was meaningless. But it's in their treatment of the dead that the Chachapoya reveal something truly distinctive about their worldview. They didn't bury their ancestors underground, hidden away from the living world. Instead, they placed them in cliffside vaults, sometimes inside elaborate sarcophagi that were sculpted and painted to look like standing human figures. These weren't hidden graves, but visible presences, positioned where the living could see them daily. Some sarcophagi face the village, others face the horizon. They stand with arms folded like watchers, not guardians exactly, and not protectors, but observers. It suggests something both beautiful and unsettling, a society that believed the dead should still witness the living, not as a metaphor, but as daily reality. The ancestors weren't gone. They were relocated, given the best seats in the house, elevated to a position where they could oversee the continuation of a life they had helped to create. This relationship between the living and the dead speaks to a worldview that was fundamentally different from the cultures that would eventually absorb the Chachapoya. There were no written moral codes, no carved commandments, no legal tablets. Instead, there was presence, the constant awareness that the actions of the living were being observed and evaluated by those who had come before. It was a form of social control that relied not on punishment but on accountability, not on fear but on continuity. The sarcophagi themselves are remarkable works of art, each one individually crafted and painted with care. Some show traces of textiles, jewelry, or other grave goods that were meant to accompany the deceased into whatever came next. Others are decorated with geometric patterns or stylized faces that may represent the individual buried within, or maybe more symbolic representations of the transition from life to death to watchful afterlife. When the Inca finally absorbed the Chachapoya, they began the slow process of cultural erasure that would be completed by the Spanish. Chachapoya leaders were displaced or eliminated. Their children were married into other tribes or relocated to different parts of the empire. Their places were renamed with Quechua words. Their gods were replaced with Inca deities. Their stories were retold in ways that served imperial purposes. Later came the Spanish, with missionaries and muskets, with diseases that devastated indigenous populations and colonial systems that dismantled traditional ways of life. By the 1600s, the Chachapoya had vanished from the historical record. No lineage, no language, no defense against forgetting. But the cliffs held on, the faces of the sarcophagi did not blink, and some still stand. Recent archaeological work has revealed the true extent of Chachapoya civilization. Using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, researchers have identified hundreds of previously unknown sites scattered across the cloud forest. Stone circles, terraced fields, burial complexes, and defensive works that speak to a culture far more extensive and sophisticated than the Spanish chronicles suggested. But each new discovery only deepens the mystery because none of them contain the kind of written records that would allow us to hear the Chachapoya speak in their own voices. One tomb, discovered in a cleft of rock so narrow that researchers needed ropes and climbing gear to reach it, contained the remains of what appeared to be a high-status individual. The bones were wrapped in textiles that had been preserved by the dry mountain air, hands posed deliberately in what may have been a ritual position. Above the chamber, someone had painted twin dots, eyes perhaps, watching whoever approached. But there was no name, no date, no symbol, for I was here. Only the placement, only the gaze. This absence of self-identification is perhaps the most poignant aspect of Chachapoya culture. They created lasting monuments, sophisticated architecture, and elaborate burial practices, but they never felt the need to sign their work. They built for eternity but accepted anonymity. They understood that individual names fade, but collective memory, properly preserved, can endure. Standing in the ruins of Quelap, surrounded by the mist that gives the cloud forest its name, you begin to understand something about the Chachapoya approach to permanence. They didn't trust words to carry their legacy forward. Words could be mistranslated, reinterpreted, or deliberately distorted by conquerors. Instead, they trusted stone and placement, the careful positioning of their works in a landscape that would outlast any empire. The strategy almost worked. The Spanish found Quelap but couldn't explain it. They recorded its existence but couldn't decode its meaning. They destroyed the culture that built it but couldn't erase the structure itself. And so the Chachapoya achieved a kind of immortality through mystery, a presence that persists precisely because it refuses to be fully understood. But this immortality comes at a cost. What does it mean for a people to be remembered only by those who erased them? What do we lose when a civilization's voice is replaced by its conqueror's story? The Chachapoya become whatever we project onto them. Noble savages, fierce warriors, mysterious architects, but never quite themselves. The cliffs still hold their breath. The eyes still watch. The names are missing, but the silence is not empty. Maybe it was always meant to be above us, not hidden, but simply out of reach. And maybe that's the most profound legacy of all, the understanding that some things are worth preserving even if they can never be fully explained. In the end, the Chachapoya may have achieved exactly what they intended. They built monuments that would survive conquest, created mysteries that would outlast solutions, and established a presence that would endure long after their voices had been silenced. They trusted future generations to feel what they felt when they looked out over the cloud-wrapped valleys, to understand through intuition what couldn't be captured in words. The tomb faces the void, still watching, still waiting. And perhaps that's enough. Long before any of these civilizations rose to build their monuments and mysteries, when the world was still emerging from the grip of ice, there were others. These people left no towers, carved no faces, built no cities, yet they may have been the most widespread civilization of all, their tools scattered across 2 continents, their presence felt from Alaska to Chile. The blade emerges from the earth like a whisper made solid. Fluted down the center, balanced, lethally elegant, it catches the light as if it remembers how to kill. But it lies alone in the dry field, no bones nearby, no fire pit, no dwelling, no companions, just stone and soil and the weight of 13,000 years. This is how we know the Clovis people, not through their words, not through temples or graves, but through a spear point buried deep in time, still sharper than history. They were among the first, maybe not the first humans, in the Americas. That debate continues to shift with each new discovery, but certainly the first we can trace by the work of their hands. Their tools appear suddenly in archaeological layers dated to around 11,000 BCE, crafted from flint, obsidian, and chert, with such precision that some archaeologists still argue whether their techniques have ever been surpassed. Each point follows the same template, a distinctive flute carved from the base, edges napped to razor sharpness, proportions that speak of minds that understood both physics and beauty. But they left no marks of ownership, no carving, no symbols, no attempt at legacy. Just movement across a landscape that stretched from horizon to horizon, unmarked by the boundaries that would later divide it into nations and states. Clovis points have been found across 2 continents, from New Mexico to Nova Scotia, from Montana to Venezuela. Not many, perhaps a few thousand, recovered from decades of archaeological work, but enough to show that someone once passed through these places, leaving behind only the tools they lost or abandoned. Always the same form, always functional, never expressive. No boundary walls, no burial mounds, no monumental stones. If they spoke to the earth didn't write it down. What kind of people move like that? The conventional answer is nomadic hunters, following mammoth and bison herds across the Ice Age landscape, living near rivers and seasonal camps, building nothing that survived. But their tools suggest something more complex. These weren't crude improvisers scratching out subsistence in a harsh world. They measured, they planned, they held symmetry in their minds. The precision required to create a Clovis point demands not just skill, but patience, teaching, and a deep understanding of stone that must have been passed down through generations. Yet they chose not to leave their mark in any other way. Where other cultures built monuments to ensure their remembrance, the Clovis people seemed content to vanish into the landscape they moved through. They were master craftsmen who signed none of their work, urban planners who built no cities, storytellers who told no stories we can hear. The archaeological record tells us they lived during the end of the last ice age, in a world that was both abundant and dangerous. Massive creatures roamed the landscape: mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, cave bears, saber-toothed cats. The Clovis people hunted some of these animals, as evidenced by kill sites where their points have been found embedded in ancient bones. But they also lived alongside them, adapted to an ecosystem that was constantly changing as the ice sheets retreated and the climate warmed. Their technology was sophisticated in ways that go beyond simple tool-making. The fluted point design represents a remarkable innovation. The central channel not only lightened the point, but also created a more secure attachment to the wooden shaft. This wasn't accidental, it was engineered. The consistency of the design across thousands of miles suggests a shared knowledge base, a cultural tradition that was maintained even as these people spread across an entire continent. But maintenance requires communication, and communication usually leaves traces. Where are the gathering places where knowledge was shared? Where are the workshops where masters taught apprentices? Where are the ritual sites where the spiritual significance of the hunt was acknowledged? The Clovis people seem to have existed in a state of perpetual motion, learning and teaching and creating without ever stopping long enough to leave a permanent mark. There are almost no graves, no ceremonial spaces, no preserved mythologies. The rare Clovis burial sites, like the Anzac child discovered in Montana, are so isolated, so statistically improbable, that they feel like exceptions to a rule we still don't understand. The infant was buried with over 100 tools and weapons, suggesting that even 13,000 years ago, some individuals were deemed worthy of special treatment. But one burial among thousands of tool sites only deepens the mystery. Where did everyone else go when they died? The Clovis people didn't enshrine their dead, didn't sculpt gods, didn't leave maps. They moved through the world like a careful thought, present but not persistent. And then, after roughly 300 years of archaeological visibility, they vanish. Not suddenly, not explosively, but gradually, like a conversation that simply stops. Their distinctive tool technology disappears from the record, replaced by other styles, other approaches to stoneworking, other ways of being human in North America. The reasons for their disappearance are still debated. Some blame the extinction of megafauna. As the great Ice Age mammals died out, perhaps the Clovis way of life became unsustainable. Others suspect environmental shifts, the rapid warming at the end of the Pleistocene, that transformed ecosystems across the continent. A few researchers have proposed more catastrophic explanations: meteor impacts, volcanic eruptions, or disease outbreaks that decimated human populations. But there's another possibility, one that's harder to prove but more intriguing to consider. Maybe the Clovis people didn't disappear at all. Maybe they simply became other cultures, their distinctive tool technology abandoned in favor of new approaches better suited to changing times. Maybe the name Clovis represents not a people, but a moment, a particular way of being human that lasted just long enough to leave its mark in stone. This interpretation suggests that the Clovis people were not victims of circumstance, but masters of adaptation. They appeared when conditions favored their way of life, thrived for as long as those conditions lasted, and then transformed themselves into something else when the world changed. They were shapeshifters, capable of reinventing themselves so completely that even their tools became different. Today, a single point lies in a museum drawer, labeled and catalogued but still mysterious. Another rests beneath a farmer's field, waiting to be discovered. Another was uncovered by a riverbank, photographed, and stored in a box that may not be opened for decades. They don't speak, they don't depict, they don't explain. But they still cut through everything we thought we knew about early human societies. Modern archaeologists continue to debate whether the Clovis people were truly the first Americans or simply the first we can identify through their distinctive technology. New discoveries keep pushing back the date of human arrival in the Americas, suggesting that people may have been here thousands of years before the first Clovis point was mapped. But regardless of whether they were first or simply early, the Clovis people represent something unique in human history, a culture that chose function over form, movement over monument, presence over permanence. Standing in the field where that first blade was found, you begin to understand something about the Clovis approach to existence. They didn't try to impose themselves on the landscape or bend it to their will. They moved through it like water, following the path of least resistance, adapting to whatever conditions they encountered. They were nomads not by necessity but by choice, people who understood that the only constant is change, and that the best way to survive is to never become too attached to any particular place or way of being. Maybe that's the most profound legacy of the Clovis people, not what they built, but what they chose not to build. They could have erected monuments, established permanent settlements, developed systems of writing or record-keeping. Instead, they chose to travel light, to leave only the tools they needed for survival, to trust that their knowledge would be passed down through teaching rather than inscription. In a world obsessed with leaving permanent marks, with building monuments that will outlast their creators, the Clovis people offer a different model. They suggest that some forms of human achievement are best measured not by what survives but by what was experienced, not by what was built but by what was understood. They mastered the blade but never once sharpened the word. They moved across continents but drew no lines. They lived fully but left quietly. And perhaps that's exactly what they intended. In their silence, they achieved a kind of immortality that no monument could provide. They became part of the landscape they moved through. Their presence felt not in stone or steel, but in the very ground beneath our feet. They remind us that there are many ways to be remembered, and that sometimes the most profound legacy is the one that refuses to announce itself. The blade waits in the earth, patient as stone, sharp as the day it was made. It carries no name, bears no inscription, tells no story beyond the simple fact of its existence. But in its perfect silence, it speaks of people who understood that the most important things can't be carved into stone or written on paper. They can only be lived, passed from hand to hand, from teacher to student, from one generation to the next. What if there were people who mastered the blade but never once sharpened the word? What if some civilizations didn't vanish, they simply never asked to be remembered? Across an ocean and a continent away, in the red earth of West Africa, another discovery would shatter assumptions about when and where sophisticated art could emerge. A tin miner's shovel would uncover what archaeologists thought impossible, faces carved with emotional depth that belonged to no known civilization, created in a time and place where such artistry wasn't supposed to exist. The shovel hits something hard, and the tin miner curses. Another rock, another delay in the endless work of extracting metal from Nigerian soil. But when he brushes away the red earth, what emerges isn't stone, it's clay, fired and shaped by human hands. A face stares up at him from the ground, hollow eyes wide with an expression that seems both ancient and immediate. The nose is broad, the lips full, the ears pierced with holes that once held ornaments now lost to time. Lines are carved into the cheeks, not randomly, but deliberately, like a language written in flesh. It looks ancient, but not crude. It feels familiar, but belongs to nothing anyone can explain. This was the first known sculpture of the Nok, discovered in the 1920s in the Jos Plateau of central Nigeria. But the pieces had been waiting much longer, over 2,000 years, buried in the red laterite soil of West Africa, keeping their silence until a miner's tool accidentally cracked the earth above them. The discovery should have been impossible. According to every textbook and narrative about African civilization, sophisticated artistic traditions weren't supposed to emerge in sub-Saharan Africa until much later, after contact with Mediterranean cultures, after the introduction of iron technology, after the rise of great kingdoms like Ghana and Mali. But here was evidence of something different, sculptures that combined technical mastery with emotional realism created by people who had mastered the art of terracotta firing when most of the world was still working with crude pottery. Some of the earliest Nok artifacts date back to 1500 BCE, making them older than many Egyptian dynasties, older than the introduction of iron to West Africa, older than the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. They represented a level of artistic sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about the development of human creativity. These weren't primitive figurines or ritual objects of mysterious purpose. They were portraits, individual faces rendered with such skill and sensitivity that they seemed to breathe. But who made them? The question hangs in the air like smoke from a fire whose source has been forgotten. There is no written language left behind, no stone steles, no royal names carved into monument walls, no epic poems survive to tell their stories, no genealogies trace their lineages, no religious texts explain their beliefs. Just art, hundreds of terracotta sculptures scattered across thousands of square miles of Nigerian landscape, each one a masterpiece, each one anonymous. The Nok left no city walls, no pyramids, no temples with inscriptions. If they had cities, the rainforest reclaimed them. If they had palaces, the tropical climate dissolved them back into earth. If they had written records, the humidity and insects consumed them long before archaeologists arrived to ask questions. What remains are the faces, eloquent, expressive, enduring, speaking in a language that transcends words but offers no translation. And what faces they are. Some have holes drilled through their pupils, as if to see better into whatever realm they were meant to observe. Others wear intricate hairstyles that suggest rank, ritual significance, or simple personal vanity. Some show signs of illness or age, others the smooth perfection of youth. One figure holds a hand to its chin in contemplation, another presses fingers to its lips in a gesture of silence or secrecy. They seem human in a way that idealized royal portraits never do, not divine, but reflective, not perfect, but real. The emotional range displayed in Nok sculpture is remarkable. Joy, sorrow, contemplation, alertness, peace, the full spectrum of human experience rendered in clay with a subtlety that wouldn't be out of place in a Renaissance workshop. These artists understood anatomy, proportion, and the way light plays across facial features. They knew how to capture not just the appearance of a person, but their inner life, their personality, their individual way of being in the world. Were they ancestors venerated in household shrines? Masks worn during ceremonies? Burial markers placed over graves? Teaching tools used to instruct children about their heritage? The truth is, no one knows. Most Nok artifacts were discovered accidentally, like that first face found by the tin miner, or looted from archaeological sites before scholars could study them in context. By the time researchers realized what they were looking at, the map to understanding had been scattered to the winds. This loss of context is perhaps the greatest tragedy of Nok archaeology. Art without context is like a conversation heard through a wall. You can sense the emotion, the rhythm, the intensity, but you can't quite make out the words. The sculptures were ripped from their original settings, sold to collectors, scattered across museums and private collections around the world. We know the texture of their cheeks, but not the meaning behind their expressions. We can recreate their firing techniques, but not the stories they once told. The ironwork that accompanies some Nok sites suggests they were among the earliest iron-using peoples in West Africa, possibly developing the technology independently rather than adopting it from Mediterranean sources. This makes their civilization even more remarkable. They were innovators, pioneers, people who figured out how to transform raw ore into tools and weapons without outside instruction. But this technological achievement, like their artistic mastery, comes to us without explanation, without the cultural context that would help us understand how and why it developed. Recent archaeological work has revealed that Nok culture was more extensive than originally thought, stretching across a region larger than Germany, lasting for over 1,000 years. Radiocarbon dating of associated organic materials suggests the culture flourished from around 1500 BCE to 500 CE, making it one of the longest-lived civilizations in African history. But longevity without literacy creates its own form of mystery. How do you maintain cultural continuity across a millennium without writing? How do you preserve artistic traditions, technological knowledge, and social structures across generations without books or monuments? The answer perhaps lies in the sculptures themselves. Maybe the Nok didn't need writing because they had something else, a visual language so sophisticated, so emotionally resonant that it could carry meaning across centuries. Maybe these faces were their books, their libraries, their historical records. Maybe each sculpture was a chapter in a vast story about what it meant to be human in ancient West Africa. But if that's true, then we're reading a book in a language we don't understand, appreciating the calligraphy while missing the meaning. The faces that stare at us from museum cases are beautiful, moving, technically accomplished, but they're also profoundly silent. They offer no names, no dates, no explanations. They simply exist, perfect and mysterious like dreams made solid. Today you can find Nok heads in museums around the world, displayed behind glass, carefully lit, protected from decay. But they aren't labeled with real names, only with catalogue numbers and estimated dates. We know the texture of their cheeks, but not the people who posed for them. We can admire their artistic achievement, but not understand their cultural significance. The Nok gave us the face, but not the voice. This disconnect between artistic achievement and historical knowledge raises profound questions about memory and meaning. What does it mean when the individual is remembered, but the civilization disappears? What happens when someone's image outlives not just their body, but their language, their story, their entire world? The Nok sculptures have achieved a kind of immortality, but it's an immortality without identity, a presence without context. Standing before one of these faces in a museum, you might feel a strange sense of recognition, as if you're looking at someone you've met before. The artists who created these sculptures understood something universal about human nature, something that transcends time and culture. They captured not just the appearance of their subjects, but their humanity, their individuality, their particular way of being alive in the world. But that recognition is also a form of loss. We can see these people, feel their presence, sense their personalities, but we can't know their names or their stories. They've been rescued from the earth, but not from anonymity. They've survived the collapse of their civilization, but not the forgetting of their culture. Somewhere in Nigeria there are still Nok artifacts buried beneath the soil, whole figures untouched, unseen, and one day someone else might dig. They might uncover another head, another pair of eyes, another expression we think we understand, but they won't find a single word to explain what they're looking at, because the Nok left us everything, the faces, the skill, the beauty, the humanity, except the reason why, and maybe that's the most profound mystery of all. Not what happened to the Nok culture, but why they chose to speak in clay rather than words, to trust their faces to outlast their voices, to let their art survive while their explanations faded away. They created one of the most emotionally powerful artistic traditions in human history, then stepped back into silence, leaving us to wonder what they were trying to say. The faces wait in their cases, patient as clay, expressive as the day they were fired. They've outlived the people who made them, the culture that shaped them, the world that gave them meaning. And in their wordless eloquence they ask a question that echoes across the centuries. What survives when everything else is forgotten? What remains when the voices fade and only the faces endure? Yet if the Nok left us faces without names, there's another civilization that left us something even more puzzling: geometry without explanation. Back in North America, sprawling across the fertile river valleys of the eastern woodlands, ancient builders were creating mathematical precision on a scale that dwarfs modern engineering. Circles, squares, and octagons that can only be fully seen from heights their creators could never reach. From the ground, it's just grass, maybe a gentle rise where the earth swells slightly above the surrounding field, maybe a ditch so shallow you'd step over it without looking down. But from the sky, you see the circle, a perfect one, 1/4 mile wide, connected to a square by embankments, so precise they seem drawn with a compass. The entire complex is aligned with the movements of the moon, timed to the 18.6-year lunar cycle with an accuracy that would challenge modern surveyors. It was built by a civilization with no name we still use, no written language, no stone cities, no bronze, just earth, moved, shaped, aligned with celestial precision. And whatever they were trying to say, you can only hear it if you're not standing on it. We call them the Hopewell, not because they called themselves that, but because a 19th century farmer named Mordecai Hopewell owned the land where the mounds were first studied. They lived in what's now the Ohio River Valley, but they weren't a single empire. They were a web of connected peoples linked by trade, belief, and something else, a shared understanding of geometry that stretched from the Great Lakes to Florida, from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. Their works required a kind of patience that defies our modern tempo. Tons of soil moved basket by basket, circular enclosures the size of football fields, octagons with angles that match astronomical cycles, straight lines that run for kilometers but vanish when you step too close. They were architects of invisibility, builders who created monuments that could only be fully appreciated from a perspective they could never achieve. The scale is breathtaking. At Newark, Ohio, Two massive circles once connected by a 3-kilometer processional way that could have accommodated thousands of people walking in procession. At Chillicothe, paired mounds rise like twin thoughts from the valley floor. At Mound City, burial sites are laid out with a formality that feels like grammar, but a grammar made of silence, understood through movement rather than reading. No writing system has ever been found, no symbols etched in stone, no marks on wood, no clay tablets explaining the meaning of the shapes. Yet the shapes persist, and their precision suggests they were far from random. The Great Circle at Newark encompasses 1,200 feet in diameter and is accurate to within a few feet of perfect circularity. The octagon connected to it aligns with the maximum and minimum moonrise positions, creating a lunar observatory that functioned for centuries. This presents a paradox that challenges our assumptions about knowledge and communication. How do you achieve such mathematical precision without written formulas? How do you maintain accuracy across generations without instruction manuals? How do you coordinate construction projects spanning decades without blueprints or documentation? The answer, perhaps, lies in the burials themselves. Inside the mounds were graves, not mass burials or chaotic interments, but carefully layered arrangements that speak of ritual and meaning. Some bodies were cremated, others laid whole, often surrounded by mica cut into symbolic shapes, copper ornaments worked into intricate designs, obsidian from Yellowstone, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico. A continent's worth of offerings representing trade networks that spanned thousands of miles and lasted for centuries, but not a single name survives. These weren't just graves, they were messages, but in a language of arrangement rather than inscription. The placement of objects, the orientation of bodies, the selection of materials, all of it seems to follow rules we can observe but not decode. The Hopewell developed a form of communication that was architectural, knowledge encoded in form and space rather than words. Modern archaeologists have attempted to decode this spatial language. The mathematical precision of the earthwork suggests astronomical knowledge rivaling that of any ancient civilization. The alignments track solstices and equinoxes, mark the rising and setting of significant stars, model celestial ratios with an accuracy that couldn't have been accidental. Some researchers see cosmology in the layouts, a worldview written in miles and shadows, a philosophy expressed through the movement of Earth and the passage of time. But we don't know how they did it. No rulers survive, no measuring tools, no blueprints or construction records, only repetition, the same angles, the same proportions, the same astronomical alignments appearing across hundreds of sites over hundreds of years. This suggests a knowledge system so robust it could be maintained without writing, so precise it could be transmitted without documentation. The Hopewell trade networks were as sophisticated as their earthworks. Copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, obsidian from the Rockies, shells from both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. All of it moved along pathways that existed before roads, coordinated by people who left no written contracts or shipping manifests. The fact that identical artifacts appear at sites thousands of miles apart suggests not just trade, but shared cultural understanding, common symbols and meanings that transcended local dialects and regional differences. These weren't primitive people scratching out subsistence in the wilderness. They were sophisticated mathematicians, astronomers, engineers, and artists who chose to work in media we don't recognize as permanent. They built libraries out of landscape, wrote histories in the arrangement of mounds, created textbooks that could only be read by walking through them. And then around 500 CE, they stopped. Not suddenly, not violently, but across generations. The earthworks ended, the patterns ceased. People still lived in the valley, but the memory of the circles dimmed. There's no sign of invasion, no fire layer, no evidence of collapse. Just a quiet turning of the page, a gradual forgetting of the old ways. This disappearance is as mysterious as the culture itself. The Hopewell tradition didn't end with conquest or catastrophe, but with transformation. The people who built the earthworks became the people who didn't. Their children grew up with different priorities, different ways of understanding the world. The knowledge that had been passed down through generations was allowed to fade, not because it was taken away, but because it was no longer needed. Today, most of their works have been ploughed over. Farm fields erase the edges, roads cut through the alignments, suburbs sit where the moon once rose between embankments. The Newark earthworks, once a complex covering 4 square miles, now survive in fragments. The Great Circle is preserved as a park, but the octagon serves as a golf course, its sacred geometry reduced to recreational space. This destruction isn't just archaeological loss, it's the erasure of a form of knowledge we're only beginning to understand. The Hopewell didn't build monuments to ego or empire. They built teaching tools, ceremonial spaces, astronomical instruments that functioned for centuries. They created a technology of meaning that worked without words, a system of communication that spoke through space and time. But some earthworks remain, barely visible from ground level, but clearly defined from above. Flying over the Ohio River Valley, you can still see the circles, squares, and octagons that once organized the spiritual life of an entire region. They're ghosts in the landscape, shadows of a civilization that chose to speak in a language we're still learning to hear. Standing in the center of the Great Circle at Newark, you're surrounded by earthen walls that rise just high enough to frame the horizon. The space feels both intimate and vast, designed for gathering, but also for contemplation. As the sun sets, shadows move across the embankments with a rhythm that suggests the passage of not just hours, but seasons, years, generations. It makes you wonder whether the Hopewell built for the sky, whether they spoke to something that never read words but understood shape and shadow. Maybe they realized that some knowledge is too important to trust to writing, too sacred to reduce to symbols. Maybe they understood that the most profound truths can only be experienced, not explained. We think of writing as marks on stone or paper, but what if they wrote with distance, with rhythm, with silence? What if a sentence could be half a mile long and only made sense when walked across? What if the most important libraries were built not with books but with earth, designed to be read not with eyes but with feet? The Hopewell left no alphabet, no scrolls, no carved laws, but the earth still holds their message, patient as stone, precise as mathematics, mysterious as the moon that guided their construction. The question isn't whether they had something to say. The evidence of their earthworks proves they did. The question is whether we've forgotten how to listen, whether we've stopped looking from high enough to see the patterns they traced across the landscape. Their circles remain, waiting for someone to remember that knowledge doesn't always come in books, that some truths are too large for pages, that the most enduring messages might be the ones written in the ground itself. And if you stand in the right place at the right time, under the right moon, you might just catch a glimpse of what they were trying to tell us, not in words, but in the language of earth and sky, shadow and light, time and space. Did we forget how to listen, or did we stop looking from high enough? But perhaps the most haunting monuments of all lie scattered across a landscape so vast and empty that you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. On the wind-swept steppes of Kazakhstan, where the horizon stretches unbroken in every direction, ancient people created something that speaks not to crowds or cities, but to the sky itself. Stone arrangements that have been tracking the sun's journey for over 2,000 years, patient as the grassland, enduring as the stars. The steppe is not silent. It hums with wind, with insects, with the shifting heat that rises from grasses that stretch unbroken to the horizon. And somewhere, In that expanse, where there are no trees, no towns, no sign of anyone, you see them. Stones set in arcs paired with low mounds, like someone was drawing a question on the land using only shadows, no text, no monument, just curves of rock facing the sun. This is the legacy of the Tasmola culture, a people who lived on the Kazakh steppe between roughly 800 and 500 BCE. They didn't build cities or carve gods. They left no tablets, no scrolls, no alphabet, but they built with direction, with timing, with placement. And what they made has lasted longer than most empires. Across the vast grasslands of Kazakhstan, from the valleys of the Irtysh to the slopes of the Karatau Mountains, these formations repeat with haunting consistency. A central burial mound, then two arcs of stone curving outward like tusks, or horns, or solar arms. Archaeologists call them moustaches, though the term feels inadequate for structures that seem to be reaching towards something beyond language. Others think of them as compasses or sky markers, but they are older than most writing systems, and they point to something we've nearly forgotten how to read. The Tasmola people were likely semi-nomadic herders, moving with their flocks across the seasonal pastures of the steppe, living in rhythms not captured by permanent architecture. Their dwellings were temporary, their tools were portable, their language was unrecorded. Even their name is not their own. It was given by modern archaeologists after a single excavation site. But they left something behind that was meant to endure, a choreography of stone that follows the sun across the sky. Many of these arc formations align with solar events, particularly the summer and winter solstices. As the sun rises on the longest day of the year, its light casts a beam that runs precisely between the stones. At sunset, the dying light falls perfectly within the curve's embrace. Daylight becomes a kind of message, shadow becomes a form of writing, and the entire landscape transforms into a calendar that needs no numbers or names. Imagine living by that rhythm, no clocks, no scripts, just the certainty that the sky knows what comes next. The Tasmola people built their ceremonies around the most reliable constant in their world, the movement of the sun across the heavens. They created a technology of time that required no maintenance, no priests, no written instructions. It simply worked day after day, year after year, for as long as the earth continued to turn. Burial was central to their ritual practice. Each formation begins with a kurgan, a mound containing a body laid with care, often accompanied by bronze items, horse remains, and small artifacts that speak of a pastoral life. But never a name, never an epitaph. The stone arcs weren't built to glorify the dead in the way we understand it. They didn't list achievements or quote prayers. Instead, they shaped the horizon, creating a sacred geometry that would endure long after the body had returned to earth. The positioning was deliberate and sophisticated. The mounds are placed at the focal point of the stone arcs, creating a relationship between the deceased and the daily journey of the sun. As the light moves across the sky, it interacts with the stones in ways that would have been visible to anyone participating in ceremonies at these sites. The dead weren't simply buried, they were integrated into the cosmic order, their final resting place marked by alignments that connected them to the eternal rhythms of day and night. This entire culture reveals itself through ritual space rather than domestic life. We don't know how they cooked or sang or raised their children. We barely know what they wore or what stories they told around their fires, but we know where they watched the sun rise, how they guided the wind through their stone arrangements, how they marked the turning of time with arcs of stone and the silence between them. The scarcity of everyday artifacts is striking. While other steppe cultures left behind elaborate grave goods, decorated pottery, and evidence of complex social hierarchies, the Tasmola sites are remarkably spare. What survives is ceremony, not speech. What endures is the ritual landscape, not the domestic one. It's as if they understood that the most important aspects of human existence couldn't be captured in objects, but only in relationships between the living and the dead, between earth and sky, between temporary human life and eternal cosmic cycles. Recent archaeological work has revealed the full extent of Tasmola culture. Using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, researchers have identified hundreds of previously unknown sites scattered across the steppe. The consistency of their design, the precision of their solar alignments, and the vast geographic area they cover suggest a shared cosmology that transcended tribal boundaries. These weren't random burial sites, but components of a unified system of meaning that connected communities across thousands of square miles. The technology required to create these alignments was impressive. Without metal tools or wheeled transport, the Tasmola people moved stones weighing several tons across the flat grasslands and positioned them with astronomical precision. They understood the mechanics of celestial motion well enough to predict where the sun would rise and set on significant dates. They had mastered the art of creating permanent markers for temporary people, structures that would continue to function long after their builders were forgotten. But what did they believe would be remembered when they were gone? The stone arcs suggest a worldview focused on continuity rather than individual achievement. Unlike the pharaohs of Egypt or the kings of Mesopotamia, the Tasmola people didn't seek to immortalize themselves through monuments. Instead, they created a system that would perpetuate itself, a sacred landscape that would continue to mark time and honor the dead regardless of whether anyone remembered their names. This approach to memory and meaning reflects a profoundly different understanding of human significance. Rather than trying to preserve individual identity through writing or portraiture, the Tasmola people integrated themselves into natural processes that would outlast any written record. They trusted the sun to remember what they couldn't record, the stones to preserve what they couldn't write, the landscape to tell their story in a language that transcended words. The environmental challenges of the steppe may have influenced this philosophy. In a landscape where survival depends on mobility and adaptation, permanence becomes a different kind of achievement. The Tasmola people couldn't build cities or accumulate possessions, but they could create relationships with the eternal elements of their world. They could ensure that their ceremonies would continue even if their culture changed or disappeared. Today, most of the arcs are scattered, buried, or overgrown. Modern maps skip them, tourists rarely visit, and few people even know they exist. But they still mark the land, still catch the light, still curve like questions we forgot to ask. The GPS coordinates that locate them are more precise than any ancient map, but they can't capture what these places meant to the people who built them. Standing among these stones as the sun rises, you begin to understand something about the Tasmola approach to permanence. They didn't try to impose themselves on the landscape or force it to remember them. Instead, they worked with its natural rhythms, creating markers that would function as long as the earth continued to turn and the sun continued to rise. They achieved a kind of immortality through anonymity, a lasting presence through deliberate absence. The sun has no mouth, but it remembers. It remembers where to rise, where to set, how to cast shadows between stones placed by hands that have been dust for centuries. And maybe that's all the Tasmola people needed, a place where your name didn't matter but your direction did, where individual identity was less important than cosmic alignment, where the only legacy worth preserving was the one that would continue without human intervention. Their stone arcs remain patient as the steppe itself, waiting for the sun to rise again tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. They've outlasted the people who built them, the cultures that surrounded them, the empires that rose and fell in distant lands. If the steppes taught us that some civilizations spoke to the sky, then the islands of the Mediterranean hold a different lesson entirely. Here, on Sardinia, an island caught between Europe and Africa, touched by every major civilization, yet belonging to none, thousands of stone towers rise from hills and valleys like ancient thoughts made manifest. They've watched empires come and go for over 3 millennia, yet no one remembers who built them or why. It rises from the hillside like something watching. No door at ground level, no inscription, no decoration, just stone, heavy, weathered, and arranged with impossible patience. This is a Nuragic, one of over 7,000 scattered across the island of Sardinia like ancient sentinels frozen in time. Most people pass them without stopping. Some don't even know they're ancient, but each one was placed here for a reason, and none of them ever tell you what it was. The Nuragic civilization began around 1800 BCE and lasted until the Roman conquest in 238 BCE. For over 1,500 years, they built these towers, refined their techniques, and created one of the most distinctive architectural traditions in the ancient world. Yet they left no writings, no scrolls, no carved panels or public records. Their voice comes to us only through stone, through the careful arrangement of space, through the silent testimony of structures that have outlived their creators by millennia. The towers themselves are engineering marvels, built without mortar, using interlocking stones that fit together with mathematical precision. Some rise 3 stories tall and can support enormous weight. The largest, at Su Nuraxi in Barumini, forms the center of a complex that includes secondary towers, defensive walls, and an entire village. The skill required to create these structures was extraordinary. Each stone had to be shaped and positioned so precisely that the entire edifice would remain stable for thousands of years. But what were they for? The question has puzzled archaeologists for generations. Some say they were fortresses, defensive strongholds against raiders or rival tribes. The thick walls and elevated positions certainly suggest military purposes. Others believe they were temples, centers of ritual aligned with the sun or stars. The astronomical alignments of many Nuragi support this theory. Some researchers propose they were status symbols, Bronze Age skyscrapers that announced the wealth and power of their builders. Others suggest they were ancestral monuments, sacred spaces where the living maintained contact with the dead. The truth is, there's no definitive answer. Because there's no text, no myth, no legend passed down from the Nuragic people themselves. They built with extraordinary skill and consistency, but they didn't explain. This silence is particularly puzzling because the Nuragic people were clearly sophisticated. They worked bronze and iron, created intricate sculptures, traded across the Mediterranean, and developed agricultural techniques that supported large populations. They had the knowledge and capability to create writing systems, but they chose not to. Outside sources mention them, but only briefly. Phoenician traders wrote of strange stone dwellings on the island. Greek travelers described a people apart from the mainstream of Mediterranean civilization. Roman generals listed Sardinia as a conquered land but said little about its heart. It's as if the Nuragic civilization was seen but not listened to, observed but not understood. And once they were gone, no one kept their story. Inside the towers, spiral staircases curl upward in darkness. Narrow corridors lead to circular chambers with corbelled ceilings that demonstrate advanced understanding of structural engineering. Some chambers still contain altars, others wells that tap into underground springs. A few have yielded bronze figurines, horned warriors, animals, hybrid beings that suggest a rich mythological world. But no words, not even symbols. Their beliefs were not drawn, their gods, if they had them, left no names. Yet the architecture itself speaks. The same shapes appear across the island, the same proportions, the same relationship between inner and outer spaces. The message wasn't in what was said, but in how space itself was organized. The Nuragic people created a language of stone that communicated meaning through experience rather than explanation. Many Nuragi face the horizon in ways that suggest astronomical purposes. Some align with the solstices, marking the extreme points of the sun's annual journey. Others mirror the movements of constellations like Orion or the Pleiades. They weren't just walls, they were instruments tuned to the sky. It's as if the Nuragic people understood time not as a story to be told, but as a pattern to be built into the land, a rhythm you could live inside. The positioning of the towers also suggests a sophisticated understanding of landscape. They're placed on hills that command views of surrounding valleys, near water sources, along routes that connected different parts of the island. The network of Nuragi creates a kind of map, a system of reference points that would have been visible to anyone traveling across Sardinia. They were landmarks, communication nodes, and ceremonial centers all at once. Recent archaeological work has revealed the full complexity of Nuragic society. These weren't isolated towers, but components of thriving communities. Around the major Nuragi, archaeologists have found evidence of workshops, granaries, wells, and residential areas. The society was hierarchical, but not autocratic, community-based, but not simple. They had specialists and traders, farmers and craftsmen, all organized around these mysterious towers. The bronze figurines found at Nuragic sites offer tantalizing glimpses into their worldview. Warriors wear horned helmets and carry shields. Archers draw their bows. Priests or shamans hold ritual objects. Ships, animals, and hybrid creatures suggest a cosmology that included both earthly and supernatural elements. But without written myths to explain them, these figures remain beautiful mysteries, art without context. The Nuragic people were also skilled metalworkers, creating bronze tools, weapons, and ornaments that were traded across the Mediterranean. They had contact with Mycenaean Greeks, Phoenicians, and early Romans, but they maintained their cultural distinctiveness. Foreign influences can be seen in some of their artifacts, but the overall pattern remains uniquely Nuragic. By the time the Romans arrived in the 3rd century BCE, the Nuragic culture had already begun to fade. There's no record of great battles or decisive conquests. The towers weren't destroyed, they were simply abandoned. The people didn't resist with armies or leave messages behind. They just stopped being noticed, absorbed into the broader currents of Mediterranean history. But the towers stayed. Even now, in fields and on cliffsides, they remain. Some are crumbling, their stones scattered by time and weather. Others stand nearly intact, their internal chambers still accessible to visitors. All of them are waiting, patient, as the island itself, holding their secrets in stone. The mystery of the Nuragi reflects a broader puzzle about the nature of communication and memory. The Nuragic people created one of the most enduring architectural traditions in human history, yet they chose to remain silent about its meaning. They built monuments that would outlast any written record, structures that continue to function as landmarks and symbols thousands of years after their creators died. Standing inside a Nuragi today, you can feel the cool stone curve around you, climb the tight spiral stair, peer through a window slit toward the sky. The experience is immediate and powerful, a direct connection to the minds that shape these spaces. You begin to understand that perhaps the architecture itself was the message, that the Nuragic people trusted stone to carry their thoughts forward in ways that words never could. The towers continue to dominate the Sardinian landscape, still serving as reference points for travelers, still marking the rhythm of seasons through their alignments with celestial events. They've outlasted the civilization that built them, the empires that conquered them, the languages that once explained them. And maybe that's exactly what their builders intended. What if the towers weren't made to defend but to witness? Not built for the living but for whatever comes after? What if the Nuragic people understood that the most important messages are the ones that don't need translation, that speak directly to the human experience of space and time and landscape? You can stand inside one today, feel the weight of stone above you, listen to the wind moving through chambers that have echoed with human voices for millennia. And in that moment, you might understand what the Nuragic people knew, that some truths are too important for words, that the most enduring communication happens not through language, but through the careful arrangement of space, the precise positioning of stone, the creation of places that will continue to speak long after the voices that built them have faded into silence. Who stood here before? What did they see? And why didn't they write it down? The questions echo through the chambers, unanswered but somehow unnecessary. The towers themselves are the answer, patient and enduring, waiting for us to learn their wordless language of stone and sky and time. Sometimes the cruelest mysteries are the ones we created ourselves. Far from Sardinia's ancient towers, scattered across volcanic islands that rise from the Atlantic like forgotten stepping stones, lived a people whose story we almost know, and that almost makes their silence all the more heartbreaking. The Guanches of the Canary Islands were still alive when Europeans arrived, still speaking, still remembering. But within a century their voices had gone silent forever, leaving behind only their carefully preserved dead to speak for a world that no longer existed. The cave is cool, dry, and full of silence, but not emptiness, because someone is still here. A body, curled, wrapped, dried by centuries of volcanic air, stares upward with hollow sockets that once held eyes. The skin is tight across ancient bones, the teeth intact, the limbs positioned with care. They placed him gently, tucked with woven fibers, surrounded by others like him, family perhaps, or chosen companions for whatever journey they believed lay ahead. No words were carved nearby, no prayers left behind, but it doesn't feel forgotten, it feels deliberate. This is how the Guanches prepared their dead, and the dead are almost all that remains. Before the Spanish arrived in the 1400s, the Canary Islands were already full of life. The Guanches had lived there for centuries, possibly millennia, having somehow made the dangerous journey from North Africa across 90 miles of open Atlantic. They built with stone, farmed terraces on volcanic slopes, crafted pottery with geometric patterns, and sailed between islands in boats made from animal skins. They worshipped the sky, honored their ancestors, and developed a society that was both sophisticated and sustainable. But they never wrote. Their history was passed from voice to voice, chants, stories, rituals that carried the weight of generations, and when the conquerors came, those voices went silent, quickly. The Spanish brought swords and missions and paper. They wrote things down, but not the Guanches, not in their own language. The indigenous people of the Canary Islands became subjects for colonial documentation, converted souls for missionary records, but never authors of their own story. Their conquest was swift and brutal, completed within a single century. By 1496, the last free Guanche stronghold had fallen, and with it, an entire way of understanding the world. What survives are fragments, descriptions by outsiders, bones in caves, artifacts in museums, and the mummies, dozens of them perfectly preserved in volcanic shelters scattered across the islands. Men, women, children, wrapped in goatskins and woven mats, eyes painted shut, limbs bound not in fear, but in intention. They weren't discarded or hidden away, they were protected, honored, treated as if death were not an ending, but a transformation. The mummification process was elaborate and spiritual. The Guanches removed the internal organs, washed the body in salt water, then dried it in the sun before wrapping it in prepared animal skins. Some bodies were painted with red ochre, others adorned with jewelry or personal items. The process could take weeks or months, suggesting a culture that had both the time and the reverence to properly honor their dead. The placement of these mummies tells its own story. Some lie facing the sea, as if watching for something that might arrive from across the water. Others are curled in fetal position, suggesting beliefs about rebirth or return to the womb of the earth. They were placed in caves that were difficult to access, protected from the elements and from casual disturbance. The Guanches believed in something beyond death. We know that much from the care they took with their dead. We just don't know what they called it. There are no temples left, no scrolls, no gravestones with inscriptions, just the bodies and some tools and stories written by those who ended them. The Spanish chroniclers described the Guanches as tall and fair-skinned, brave in battle, skilled in their crafts. But these descriptions are filtered through European eyes, shaped by colonial assumptions about civilization and barbarism. The Guanches become whatever the Spanish needed them to be, noble savages, worthy opponents, or obstacles to Christian progress. Recent genetic studies trace the Guanches back to North African Berber roots, confirming what the physical evidence suggested. The DNA reveals ancient connections to the peoples of Morocco and Algeria, helping to solve the mystery of how they reached the islands. But genetics can only say where someone came from, not who they were. It doesn't carry belief or memory or song. We know the Guanches mummified their dead, but we don't know the words they spoke while doing it. We know they had gods, but not their names. We know they fought back, briefly, before the last island fell, but their reasons, their leaders, their hopes were never recorded in their own voice. The erasure was systematic and swift. Spanish colonization brought not just political control, but cultural transformation. The Guanches were forced to convert to Christianity. Their children were taken to be raised in Spanish households, their religious practices were banned, and their language was suppressed. Those who survived the initial conquest faced diseases they had no immunity to: smallpox, measles, influenza. Within a few generations, the population had been decimated. But the physical destruction was only part of the story. The deeper tragedy was the loss of meaning. The Guanches had developed their own explanations for the world around them, their own creation stories, their own understanding of the relationship between life and death, their own ways of making sense of existence on isolated islands in the middle of the ocean. All of this was dismissed as paganism, replaced with foreign concepts that carried no connection to the landscape or the ancestors or the specific challenges of island life. A few words survive, not full sentences, but fragments overheard by monks and soldiers. Spanish chroniclers recorded some terms for places, practices, and beliefs, but the grammar is gone, the meanings guessed, the soul lost. The Guanche language becomes a collection of isolated words floating in a sea of Spanish interpretation, like pieces of a puzzle, with most of the pieces missing. Archaeological evidence suggests that Guanche society was more complex than early Spanish accounts indicated. They had social hierarchies, specialized crafts, and trade networks that connected the different islands. They created astronomical observations, developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, and maintained oral traditions that encoded practical knowledge about navigation, weather patterns, and seasonal cycles. But all of this existed in the realm of memory and speech, vulnerable to the kind of disruption that written records might have survived. The irony is profound. The Guanches chose to preserve their dead with extraordinary care, creating mummies that would last for centuries, but they didn't preserve their ideas, their stories, their ways of understanding the world. The body outlasted the mind, the flesh outlasted the spirit. What remains is the shell without the essence, the form without the meaning. Today you can visit the mummies in museums across the Canary Islands. They lie behind glass, labeled and dated, preserved by science rather than ritual. The museum placards tell you their approximate age, their probable social status, the techniques used to preserve them. But the story inside them, the dreams, the fears, the songs, those were never written, and no microscope can bring them back. Standing before these ancient faces, you might feel a strange sense of intimacy. These were real people who lived and loved and worried about the future. They had names, personalities, relationships, hopes for their children. They told jokes and sang songs and watched the sun set over the Atlantic. They developed explanations for thunder and earthquakes, created rituals for birth and death, and found ways to maintain social cohesion in small island communities. But all of that inner life, all of that human richness, exists now only in the silent testimony of preserved flesh. The Guanches achieved a kind of physical immortality through their mummification practices, but they lost the immortality of ideas, of stories, of the particular ways they had learned to be human in their particular place and time. The volcanic caves that hold their remains are still there, still dry and cool, still echoing with the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. The islands themselves are still there, still beautiful, still shaped by the volcanic forces that created them. But the Guanches' understanding of those forces, their ways of relating to the landscape, their methods of finding meaning in isolation, all of that has been replaced by other stories, other explanations, other ways of being human in the same place. They left no books, no myths in ink, no carved laws, but they left their bodies and the quiet defiance of being prepared, even when no one would remember why. In their careful attention to the dead, they demonstrated beliefs about continuity, about the importance of honoring those who came before, about the possibility that death might not be the end of the story. What happens when the only thing left of a people is their flesh? When their voice never made it past the wind that still blows across the islands where they once lived? The question echoes through the caves where their mummies rest, patient and mysterious, holding secrets that no amount of scientific analysis can unlock. The Guanches remind us that preservation takes many forms, and that some kinds of knowledge are more fragile than others. They show us what happens when an entire way of understanding the world exists only in memory, only in the living voices of people who can be silenced. They demonstrate the difference between surviving and being remembered, between the body and the story, between the facts that can be measured and the meanings that can only be told. In the end, perhaps the silence itself is the message. The Guanches speak to us now, not through words, but through absence, not through explanation, but through mystery. Their mummies ask questions that have no answers, raise possibilities that can never be confirmed, and remind us that the most important human experiences might be the ones that can never be written down. Across the world, wherever European explorers encountered architectural achievements that challenged their assumptions about who could build what, the response was remarkably consistent: deny, diminish, or invent alternative histories. Nowhere is this clearer than in the heart of southern Africa, where massive stone walls rise from the savannah, walls so sophisticated that colonizers refused to believe African hands had built them. The wall curves like a wave frozen in stone. No cement holds it together, no metal reinforces its joints. Just thousands of granite blocks stacked so tightly that no blade fits between them. It rises from the African savannah without fanfare, without carving, without inscription, without names etched into the foundation. But it has stood here for nearly 1,000 years and still it doesn't speak. This is Great Zimbabwe, not a ruin or a mystery, but a capital that was once alive with wealth, trade, and power. At its peak, between 1200 and 1450 CE, it may have housed 20,000 people. Its reach extended across southern Africa, its influence felt from the Indian Ocean to the Kalahari Desert. Gold flowed through its markets, cattle grazed beyond its walls, and artifacts from across the known world found their way to its stone-lined courtyards. Beads from India, porcelain from China, and glass from Persia have been found among its remains, testament to a trading empire that connected the African interior to global networks of commerce. Yet no written record was left behind, not even a signature. When European explorers arrived in the 19th century, they refused to believe what they saw. Surely these structures weren't built by Africans. Surely a lost white tribe or wandering Phoenicians or biblical figures must be responsible. The alternative, that a sub-Saharan civilization had constructed dry stone architecture more advanced than most of medieval Europe, was too inconvenient to accept. So they erased the builders, not by destroying the walls, but by inventing new authors. And the silence of Great Zimbabwe made it easy. The archaeological evidence tells a different story. Great Zimbabwe was the culmination of a long tradition of stone building that began in the region around 1000 CE. The people who built it were the ancestors of the modern Shona people, skilled craftsmen who understood the properties of granite and developed techniques for working with it on a massive scale. They quarried the stone from nearby hills, shaped it without metal tools, and assembled it into structures that have survived centuries of weather, war, and neglect. There are no murals, no glyphs, no carved gods or royal stele. Only form, only space. The Great Enclosure is the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara, its outer wall stretching over 250 meters, standing 10 meters high in places. Within it rises a conical tower, solid, hollowless, still unexplained. Passages narrow as you enter, widening as you move deeper, not randomly but deliberately. Power expressed in structure, not in writing. The sophistication of the architecture is remarkable. The walls were built using a technique called coursing, where each layer of stones was carefully leveled before the next was added. The builders understood load distribution, creating structures that could support enormous weight without foundation or mortar. They incorporated drainage systems to prevent erosion, designed doorways that could be sealed with massive granite blocks, and created acoustic properties that would have enhanced the sound of drums and voices during ceremonies. The hill complex, perched on a granite outcrop above the valley, shows evidence of being the royal residence. Its walls follow the natural contours of the rock, creating a series of enclosures that would have provided both privacy and defense. The most sacred area, known as the Western Enclosure, contains what appears to be a temple complex with stone platforms and ritual areas. But like everything else at Great Zimbabwe, these spaces speak only through their arrangement, their proportions, their relationship to the landscape. The people who lived here had social hierarchies, religious rituals, and long-distance trade networks. The distribution of artifacts shows clear distinctions between elite and common areas. The elite had access to imported goods, lived in stone-walled compounds, and were buried with gold ornaments and exotic artifacts. The common people lived in areas outside the stone walls, in houses made of wood and clay, but they were part of the same economic system, the same cultural world. The economy was based on cattle, gold, and trade. Great Zimbabwe sat at the intersection of several important trade routes, controlling the flow of goods between the interior and the coast. Gold was mined in the surrounding hills and traded for Indian Ocean luxuries. Cattle provided not just food but also social status. The more cattle you owned, the more wives you could afford, the more political influence you could wield. The rulers of Great Zimbabwe built their power on this foundation of stone, gold, and cattle, creating a system that lasted for centuries. But no chronicles remain, no court records, no family trees, no royal decrees. Their knowledge was oral, their memory lived in voice and rhythm, carried in the minds of praise singers and storytellers who could recite genealogies stretching back generations. This system worked as long as the culture remained intact, but it was vulnerable to disruption. When the political center collapsed, when the trade routes shifted, when the voices were silenced, the memory went with them. Still, the echoes remain. Arab traders wrote about a place called Zafun or Zimbabwe, a city of stone beyond the desert, rich in gold. Portuguese sailors heard stories from the coast about a great kingdom in the interior, but the people of Great Zimbabwe themselves said nothing in text. Maybe they didn't need to. Maybe stone was enough. The decline of Great Zimbabwe was gradual rather than sudden. By 1450 CE, the city was largely abandoned, its population dispersed to other centers. The reasons are still debated: climate change, resource depletion, political instability, or the rise of competing kingdoms. But the physical infrastructure remained intact, the walls still standing, the towers still rising above the savannah. This abandonment sealed the fate of Great Zimbabwe in the historical record. Without written documents, without continuing occupation, without oral traditions that survived the colonial period, the site became a mystery. When European explorers encountered it in the 19th century, they had no local informants who could explain its history, no inscriptions to translate, no obvious connections to living cultures. The silence that had preserved the site physically also obscured its meaning. The colonial interpretation of Great Zimbabwe was shaped by racist assumptions about African capabilities. The idea that black Africans could have built such sophisticated structures challenged European beliefs about racial hierarchy and cultural evolution. So alternative theories proliferated: Phoenician traders, Arab merchants, biblical figures, lost white tribes, anyone except the local African population. These theories persisted well into the 20th century, supported by governments that had political reasons to deny African achievement. But the archaeological evidence was always clear. The pottery, the tools, the cultural artifacts all pointed to local African authorship. The building techniques were consistent with other stone structures in the region. The cultural patterns matched those of the historical Shona people. Great Zimbabwe was an African achievement built by African hands, representing African political and economic sophistication. Today, the name Zimbabwe means stone houses in the local language. It was taken from the ruins by the modern nation, a way of connecting contemporary identity to ancient achievement. But the people who built Great Zimbabwe still live in the region. Their descendants still speak languages related to those spoken in the ancient city. Their cultural practices still echo the traditions of the past. Standing at the base of the conical tower, looking up at its smooth granite surface, you can feel the weight of history, the precision of construction, the curve of stone that has defied time and weather. It wasn't built by accident, it wasn't primitive, it wasn't lost. It was made by people who didn't need to write because they knew how to build something that couldn't be erased. The silence of Great Zimbabwe speaks to different approaches to permanence and memory. While other civilizations carved their achievements into stone, wrote their histories in scrolls, or created monuments to individual rulers, the builders of Great Zimbabwe chose to let their work speak for itself. They built spaces that would function regardless of who occupied them, structures that would impress regardless of who viewed them, walls that would stand regardless of who remembered their builders. This approach to legacy reflects a different understanding of power and time. Rather than trying to preserve individual names or specific events, the builders of Great Zimbabwe created something that would outlast any written record. They trusted stone to carry their message across centuries, trusting future generations to recognize skill and sophistication even without explanatory text. The tragedy is that this trust was betrayed. When Europeans encountered Great Zimbabwe, they saw the skill and sophistication but refused to recognize its source. They admired the architecture but denied the architects. They preserved the stones but erased the story. The silence that was meant to speak across time became a void that others filled with their own assumptions and prejudices, but the stones remain patient and enduring, still demonstrating the capabilities of their builders. The walls still curve across the savannah, still rise to heights that inspire awe, still fit together with precision that challenges modern techniques. They are monuments to human achievement, testimonies to the power of stone over story, witnesses to the possibility that some civilizations chose permanence over fame. What if some civilizations chose stone over story? What if they knew power doesn't always need a name? The questions echo through the empty courtyards of Great Zimbabwe, unanswered but somehow unnecessary. The walls themselves are the answer, standing silent and strong, proving that the most enduring monuments are sometimes the ones that never explain themselves. Walking through the ruins today, you can still feel the presence of the people who built them. Not in words or inscriptions, but in the careful arrangement of space, the thoughtful positioning of doorways, the elegant curve of walls that frame the African sky. They speak to us not through language, but through stone, not through explanation, but through example, not through words, but through the enduring testimony of human hands, shaping rock into something greater than the sum of its parts. High in the Colombian Andes, where mountain lakes reflect clouds and emerald mines pierce ancient stone, the conquistadors thought they had found the ultimate prize, El Dorado, a city of gold. What they actually discovered was something far more sophisticated and infinitely more tragic, a people who understood that true wealth couldn't be kept, only given away. They say a man once stood on a raft in the middle of a mountain lake, naked, covered in gold dust that caught the morning light like liquid fire. As the water stilled around him, he poured emeralds into its depths, green stones that disappeared with barely a ripple. Gold figures followed, tiny human forms that sank toward the bottom like prayers made solid. Ornaments, masks, offerings, each one crafted with care, each one released without hesitation. Then the man himself slipped into the water, disappearing beneath the surface, washing away the gold that had transformed him into something more than human. No one wrote this down, but the lake remembers. This is the story of El Dorado, the gilded one, not a city of gold, not a vault filled with treasure, but a ritual. And behind it was a civilization high in the Colombian Andes that never carved a word, never etched a scroll, but left behind beauty too deliberate to be misunderstood. The Muisca didn't build pyramids or conquer with armies. They created a system of meaning that revolved around salt, trade, ceremony, and above all, gold, not for wealth, but for gesture. And that's what the world failed to understand. The Muisca Confederation flourished in the highlands surrounding what is now Bogotá, their territories stretching across the cool, fertile plateau of the Altiplano Cundiboyacense. They thrived there for nearly 1,000 years, from around 600 CE until the Spanish conquest in the 1530s. Their society was complex and sophisticated, with specialized craftsmen, extensive trade networks, and astronomical knowledge that guided their agricultural cycles and religious ceremonies. But it was also fundamentally different from the empires that surrounded them. Their leaders weren't kings in the European sense, but zipas and zaks, chosen not to dominate, but to harmonize trade, time, and offering. The zipa ruled the southern territories from Bacatá, modern Bogotá, while the zak governed the north from Hunza, now Tunja. These rulers didn't accumulate power through conquest, but through their ability to coordinate the complex web of relationships that held Muisca society together. They didn't write laws, they performed them. They didn't record myths, they sang them. And when it came time to honor the sacred, they didn't speak, they gave. The Muisca economy was based on salt, emeralds, and gold, but not in the way Europeans understood wealth. Salt was mined from deposits at Zipaquira and Nemocon, then traded across the Andes in cylindrical bars that served as both commodity and currency. Emeralds came from mines in the eastern mountains, prized not just for their beauty, but for their connection to water and fertility. Gold was worked into intricate objects, but it wasn't hoarded. It was offered, given away, transformed into gestures of reverence and release. Across the region, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of tunjos, tiny gold figurines placed in caves, lakes, and sacred sites. They weren't currency or trophies, but messages shaped like birds, men, gods, or hybrid creatures that seem to exist between the human and divine worlds. Some show figures with outstretched arms, others with elaborate headdresses, still others with spiral patterns that might represent the movement of water or the cycles of time. But there are no captions, no explanations, only arrangement. The tunjos speak in a language of form and placement, meaning encoded in metal rather than words. The most famous of these offerings took place at Lake Guatavita, a perfectly circular lake formed by an ancient meteorite impact. Here, according to Spanish chroniclers who heard the story second-hand, newly elected zipas underwent a ritual that transformed them from ordinary men into sacred leaders. The ceremony began before dawn, with the future ruler fasting and preparing his body with sacred plants. As the sun rose, he was covered in gold dust, not applied randomly but in patterns that had meaning, that connected him to the cosmic forces he would need to channel as leader. The golden raft that carried him to the center of the lake was itself a work of art, crafted specifically for this moment. It bore not just the Zipa, but also his attendants, priests, and the offerings that would transform the lake into a sacred space. The gold dust that covered his body wasn't decoration, but transformation. It made him into El Dorado, the Golden One, a being that existed between the human and divine worlds. When he dove into the lake, washing away the gold, he emerged as something different, not a king, but a mediator, someone who could speak to the forces that governed water, fertility, and time. The Muisca didn't hoard gold because they understood something about value that Europeans couldn't grasp. For them, gold wasn't wealth, it was weight, spiritual significance that could only be realized through release. It didn't belong to people but to moments, to the spaces between human intention and divine response. The Zipa's lake ceremony was repeated over generations, each time with new gold, new emeralds, new silence. Lake Guatavita became a sacred ledger, one that no historian could read because the language was ritual, not record. Then came the Spanish in 1537, led by Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada. They wrote everything down, they mapped the region, catalogued the myths, counted the ornaments, recorded the names of rulers and the locations of mines. But they misunderstood all of it. They thought El Dorado was a place to be found, that the gold was stored, that the Muisca had hidden their wealth out of greed. So they drained the lake, ransacked shrines, pressed for names and stories, but got only fragments, half-heard and mistranslated. The conquest was swift and brutal. The Muisca had no standing army, no military tradition, no experience with the kind of warfare the Spanish brought. Their society was built on negotiation and ceremony, not conquest and resistance. Within a few years, the Confederation was destroyed, its leaders dead or displaced, its ceremonies banned, its sacred sites desecrated. The Spanish imposed their own systems of meaning, Christianity, monarchy, written law, but they never understood what they were replacing. The cultural loss was immense. The Muisca language survived in fragments recorded by Spanish priests who were more interested in conversion than preservation. Their myths were reduced to curiosities, their ceremonies dismissed as devil worship, their sophisticated understanding of astronomy and agriculture ignored in favor of European methods. The knowledge that had sustained their civilization for centuries was allowed to fade, replaced by foreign systems that had no connection to the highland environment or the needs of the people. Today, Lake Guatavita still holds secrets. Modern divers have recovered gold from the mud, masks, rings, discs, figurines that speak to the richness of Muisca's spiritual life. But the deeper they go, the less it explains. There is no vault, no archive, just gestures frozen in metal. The objects are beautiful, technically sophisticated, clearly meaningful, but their meaning remains locked in a language of ritual that no one alive can fully translate. The tragedy of the Muisca is not just that they were conquered, but that they were misunderstood. The Spanish saw their gold and assumed greed, saw their ceremonies and assumed primitive superstition, saw their lack of writing and assumed ignorance. They couldn't conceive of a civilization that might choose to encode its deepest truths in gesture rather than text, that might trust ritual to preserve meaning more effectively than writing. Recent archaeological work has revealed the true sophistication of Muisca society. Their settlements were carefully planned, their agriculture was sustainable, their trade networks stretched across the Andes. They had systems of measurement, methods of calculation, and astronomical knowledge that guided their planting and harvesting. But all of this existed in the realm of practice rather than theory, in the realm of doing rather than explaining. Standing on the shore of Lake Guatavita today, you can still feel the power of the place. The water is dark and still, surrounded by hills that seem to hold their breath. It's easy to imagine the ceremony, the golden figure on the raft, the moment of transformation and release. But it's also easy to understand why the Spanish couldn't grasp what they were seeing. They were looking for treasure, not transcendence. They were searching for wealth, not meaning. The Muisca understood something about gold that we've forgotten. It wasn't valuable because it was rare or beautiful. It was valuable because it could be given away, because it could transform the giver and the receiver, because it could bridge the gap between human desire and divine grace. The ritual at Lake Guatavita wasn't about accumulating power, but about releasing it, about recognizing that true leadership comes not from holding on to things, but from knowing when to let them go. The Spanish wrote down everything except what the Muisca actually believed. Their own voice is gone, no writing system, no alphabet, just the weight of what they gave away. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the Muisca knew that the most important truths can't be written down, only experienced. Perhaps they understood that real wealth isn't what you can keep, but what you can release. That true power isn't in possession, but in the ability to let go. The lake still holds their offerings, still reflects the sky, still remembers the ceremony, even when the meaning has been forgotten. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the Muisca achieved exactly what they intended, not to explain their beliefs, but to embody them, not to record their truths, but to live them, not to preserve their culture in words, but to dissolve it into the landscape, into the water, into the golden silence that still shimmers beneath the surface of Lake Guatavita. So maybe gold for them wasn't power, it was release. A shimmering silence dropped into a lake. And maybe that's why we keep looking for El Dorado, not because it was hidden, but because it was never meant to be kept. The real treasure isn't waiting to be found. It's already been given away, transformed from metal into meaning, from possession into prayer, from gold into something far more valuable, the understanding that some things are too sacred to be saved. From the mountain lakes of Colombia, where gold was given to gods whose names have been forgotten, we now drift across the Pacific to one of the most isolated places on Earth. Here, on a tiny volcanic island lost in the vast blue expanse, lies perhaps the saddest tragedy of all. a civilization that managed to preserve their knowledge in wood and stone, that carved their thoughts into tablets meant to last forever, only to watch the last person who could read them disappear into silence. It looks like a whisper carved into wood. Not ink, not paint, just shallow lines etched with infinite patience into driftwood that was once part of a canoe or a palm tree. Spirals, birds, eyes, fish, symbols that repeat across the blackened surface in rows that seem to follow their own logic. You can hold it in your hands, feel the grain of the wood, trace each groove with your fingertip, but you can't read it. No one can. This is Rongorongo, the lost script of Easter Island, and it may be the only writing system in the world that still exists but died with no one left to speak it. Rapa Nui is famous for its moai, those massive stone heads that stand watch across the island with blank eyes and eternal silence. Nearly 1,000 of them dot the landscape, some buried to their shoulders, others standing proud on ceremonial platforms called ahu. They've become symbols of isolation and mystery, testament to a civilization that achieved the impossible on one of the most remote inhabited islands on Earth. But while those statues are iconic, they don't speak. Rongorongo might have. Discovered on a handful of wooden tablets in the 19th century, the glyphs appear ordered, deliberate, patterned. They were carved by hand using obsidian or shark teeth, etched into Toromiro wood that was sacred to the islanders. Some tablets are large and ceremonial, others small enough to carry in a priest's hand. The symbols themselves are unlike any other writing system. They combine pictographic elements with what appears to be phonetic components, creating a visual language that is both beautiful and utterly mysterious. The script was read in a unique way called Boustrafeden, as the ox ploughs, alternating left to right, then right to left, with the tablet turned upside down for each new line. This means the reader would physically manipulate the object while reading, creating a key kinesthetic connection between text and meaning that suggests reading was as much performance as interpretation. But that's all we know, and it's not enough. The mystery of Rongorongo is inseparable from the tragedy of Rapa Nui itself. For centuries, the islanders maintained their culture through oral tradition. Priests and elders recited genealogies that stretched back to the island's first settlers, seasonal calendars that guided planting and fishing, sacred chants that connected the living to their ancestors. Knowledge was carried in voices, preserved in memory, passed from master to student in an unbroken chain that had lasted for generations. But after centuries of isolation, the island faced ecological collapse. The native forests were cut down, the soil eroded, the bird populations crashed. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the 17th century, Rapa Nui society was under severe stress. Political rivalries intensified, resources became scarce, and the island's delicate ecosystem reached a tipping point from which it never recovered. Then came the Europeans. First, the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen in 1722, who gave the island its western name. Then sporadic contact with Spanish, British, and other expeditions. Each visit brought new diseases to a population with no immunity. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and syphilis devastated the islanders. Even worse were the slave raids of the 1860s, when Peruvian ships captured over 1,500 Rapa Nui people, nearly half the population, to work in the guano mines. Most died in captivity, and only a handful ever returned home. By the time Christian missionaries arrived in the 1860s, Rapa Nui society was in ruins. The old religion was suppressed, the traditional social structure was dismantled, and the oral traditions that had preserved knowledge for centuries were actively discouraged. French missionary Eugène Ayrault discovered the Rongorongo tablets in 1864, but by then the last generation of trained readers was already gone. The oral chain had broken, the voices were silenced, and the wooden tablets became artifacts rather than living texts. Some of the glyphs seem to represent recognizable objects: birds, fish, human figures, plants. Others are more abstract, suggesting concepts like fertility, stars, or spiritual forces. But without a native informant who could provide context, every interpretation remains speculation. The symbols might represent syllables, whole words, or complex ideas that require cultural knowledge to understand. They might encode genealogies, religious chants, astronomical observations, or historical records. Or they might be something else entirely, a form of proto-writing that served ritual rather than literary purposes. The structure of Rongorongo suggests it was more than decorative art. The symbols are arranged in clear sequences with recurring patterns that imply syntax or grammatical rules. Some tablets show parallel passages that might represent different versions of the same text, suggesting a tradition of copying and preserving specific content. The care taken in creating the tablets, the selection of wood, the precision of carving, the ceremonial context in which they were found, all point to a system that was valued and maintained by the community. Only about 24 authentic Rongorongo objects survive today, scattered across museums and private collections around the world. Each one is unique, but they share common elements that suggest a unified tradition. The wood is fragile, darkened by age and smoke from the caves where they were hidden. Some bear the marks of fire, evidence of the cultural destruction that accompanied colonization. The meaning encoded in their symbols has been erased not by natural decay, but by the silence that followed the loss of their readers. The tragedy is profound. We didn't lose Rongorongo to time or accident. We found it too late. The tablets were preserved, passed down through generations, protected in sacred spaces. But the people who understood them weren't protected. The knowledge needed to decode the script was carried in living memory, and when those memories were destroyed by disease, slavery, and cultural suppression, the tablets became orphans, preserved but meaningless. Modern linguists continue to study the glyphs using computational analysis to identify patterns, statistical methods to group symbols, and comparative approaches to connect them to other Polynesian traditions. They count recurring elements, catalogue variations, and map the distribution of symbols across different tablets. But without context, the symbols remain unanchored, floating in an ocean of possibility without a clear shore. Some researchers claim to have made progress in deciphering Rongorongo, identifying what they believe are lunar calendars, genealogical records, or chanted texts. But none of these claims has gained universal acceptance. The lack of a bilingual text, the small corpus of available material, and the absence of any living tradition makes verification impossible. Every proposed reading remains hypothetical, every interpretation contested. The isolation that once protected Rapa Nui culture became its curse. Unlike other Pacific societies that maintained contact with neighboring islands, the people of Easter Island developed their traditions in relative solitude. This allowed them to create something unique, a writing system that was entirely their own, uninfluenced by outside models. But it also made their culture vulnerable. When the chain of transmission was broken, there was no backup, no sister culture that had preserved similar knowledge. Standing in the British Museum, looking at the few Rongorongo tablets on display, you can feel the weight of what has been lost. These aren't just mysterious artifacts, they're the last words of a civilization, the final attempts to preserve knowledge that someone thought was important enough to carve in wood. But they're also reminders of how fragile cultural transmission can be, how quickly the thread between past and present can be severed. The symbols themselves are beautiful, stylized figures that seem to dance across the wood grain, abstract forms that suggest meaning even when they can't be understood. They were created by people who believed their message would endure, who trusted future generations to maintain the knowledge needed to read their words. That trust was betrayed not by malice but by circumstances beyond anyone's control, disease, exploitation, and the kind of cultural disruption that leaves survivors with no choice but to abandon the old ways in favor of survival. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Rongorongo is how complete the loss has been. Other ancient scripts, Linear A, the Indus Valley symbols, Proto-Elamite, remain undeciphered, but they're fragments from distant civilizations. Rongorongo is different. It was alive into the modern era, maintained by people who had names and faces and individual stories. The last reader of Rongorongo might have died in 1870 or 1880 or 1890, recent enough that their grandchildren might still be alive, but too late for any meaningful recovery of the tradition. The script waits in museum cases and storage rooms, patient as stone, silent as the moai that still guard the island. Every symbol is a question, every tablet a mystery, every line a reminder of voices that will never speak again. The wood remembers the touch of hands that carved it, the smoke of fires that hardened it, the voices that once knew how to unlock its meaning. But memory without understanding is just another form of forgetting. What if a civilization's last words were preserved, but no one left to read them? What if language, like memory, can disappear while still existing right in front of us? The questions echo through the quiet halls where Rongorongo waits, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The script exists, the symbols endure, but the voice has gone silent. And in that silence, we hear the sound of knowledge dying, of connections breaking, of the particular tragedy that occurs when preservation isn't enough, when saving the text doesn't save the meaning, when keeping the words doesn't keep the world they were meant to describe. Imagine your entire culture, its prayers, its stories, its laws carved into wood, saved for generations and then forgotten. The book survived, but the reader vanished. We're left with lines on a darkened board, a song you can see but never hear, a conversation frozen in mid-sentence with no one left to finish the thought. For our last story, we turn to a place that exists now only in computer models and the memories of fishing nets, a lost continent beneath the waves where thousands lived and died and left no trace, not because they chose silence, but because the earth itself chose to forget them. It started with a fisherman somewhere off the coast of the Netherlands, hauling in his nets from the grey depths of the North Sea. Among the silver flash of cod and herring, something caught his eye, a carved point of antler, shaped by human hands, smooth from age, barbed for hunting. The craftsmanship was unmistakable, the purpose clear. But he hadn't caught it from a forest or a field or a riverbank. He had pulled it from the bottom of the sea, from a place that had been underwater for thousands of years. That tool belonged to a world now gone, a world we didn't even know was missing. They call it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, a shallow area of the North Sea where fishing boats have been dredging up impossible artifacts for generations. Once, it was land, a vast plain stretching between what are now Britain and mainland Europe, larger than the British Isles, rich with rivers and forests and wetlands. People lived there for thousands of years, fished its lakes, hunted its forests, watched the stars from hills that are now 60 feet below the waves. Now it's a ghost continent, the largest piece of real estate in Europe that exists only in computer models and scientific papers. A civilization lost not to war or conquest, but to something far more patient and inexorable, the rising sea. 10,000 years ago, Doggerland was alive. Mesolithic communities moved through its valleys, following the seasonal migrations of reindeer and aurochs, carving tools from bone and antler, lighting fires near lakes, that no longer exist. They lived in small bands, perhaps 50 to 100 people, moving with the rhythms of the land and the animals that sustained them. They didn't write, didn't build cities, didn't create monuments to their gods or kings, but they lived for thousands of years on ground that no longer appears on any map. We only began to rediscover them by accident. Fishermen found their tools, their bones, fragments of their fires. Oil companies, surveying the seafloor for drilling sites, found riverbeds that shouldn't be there, preserved beneath layers of marine sediment. Archaeological surveys revealed the outlines of coastlines, lakes, and river systems that had been dry land when London was a distant dream and Paris was still forest. The technology that revealed Doggerland reads like science fiction. Seismic surveys bounce sound waves off the seafloor, creating three-dimensional maps of buried landscapes. Core samples bring up pollen from plants that grew in forests 8,000 years ago. Side-scan sonar reveals the meanders of ancient rivers, the curves of long, drowned coastlines. Each survey adds another piece to a jigsaw puzzle of breathtaking scope, the reconstruction of an entire lost world. What emerges from this underwater archaeology is a landscape that would have been paradise for Mesolithic hunters and gatherers. Doggerland was not the flat, featureless plain that early researchers imagined, but a diverse ecosystem of hills and valleys, rivers and lakes, forests and wetlands. The Dogger Hills rose nearly 100 feet above the surrounding plain. Rivers like the Rhine and Thames flowed across the landscape, carrying fresh water and fertile silt from the melting glaciers to the north. The climate was warming, the ice sheets retreating, and Doggerland was becoming more hospitable with each passing century. Oak and hazel forests spread across the higher ground. Wetlands provided habitat for countless species of birds and fish. Large mammals, red deer, roe deer, wild boar, aurochs, grazed in herds that could support substantial human populations. This was not a marginal environment clinging to existence at the edge of the world, but a rich, productive landscape at the heart of post-glacial Europe. The people who lived there left traces of their presence scattered across what is now the seafloor. Stone tools, worked antler, bone harpoons, the charcoal from their fires. Human remains too, skulls and bones that speak of people who were anatomically modern, culturally sophisticated, part of the great expansion of human communities that followed the retreat of the ice. They were skilled hunters, accomplished fishermen, expert at reading the signs of weather and season that governed their world. But they also faced a challenge that would ultimately prove insurmountable. As the ice sheets melted, the sea began to rise. Not all at once, but slowly, inexorably, year by year. The process took millennia, giving each generation time to adapt, to move inland, to adjust their settlements to the changing coastline. But it never stopped. The water kept coming, claiming beaches, then fields, then hills, until entire river valleys disappeared beneath the waves. The end, when it came, may have been sudden. Around 6,200 BCE, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that swept across the North Sea. Some researchers believe this catastrophic wave was what finally finished what time had already started, inundating the last high ground of Doggerland and forcing its inhabitants to flee to the hills that would become the British Isles and the coasts of what would become the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany. No one wrote down what it felt like to watch their world disappear beneath the waves. There are no myths, no last words, no graves marking the end of a way of life that had lasted for thousands of years. The people of Doggerland vanished without war, without monuments, without story. They didn't collapse, they didn't surrender, they just moved to higher ground, to other lives, to futures that would forget their past. Or they drowned, their bones joining the accumulating sediments that would bury their world for millennia. For centuries, we had no idea they were ever there. The North Sea was just water, a barrier between Britain and Europe, a place for fishing and shipping and oil drilling. But piece by piece, we've begun to see the outline of what was lost. River systems beneath the sea, pollen from forests long gone, animal bones next to shaped flint, next to human remains. The evidence is scattered and fragmentary, but it's enough to reconstruct the general shape of a vanished world. Doggerland challenges our understanding of lost civilizations because there was no catastrophe carved in stone, no burned temple, no toppled city, only silence and salt and time. Yet it held people, families, memories, beliefs, entire ways of being human that developed over thousands of years and then simply disappeared when the sea claimed the land that sustained them. It reminds us that some forms of forgetting have nothing to do with human failure or cultural collapse. Sometimes the earth itself rewrites the map. The scale of the loss is staggering. At its largest extent, Doggerland covered nearly 100,000 square miles, an area larger than Great Britain. It was not empty wilderness, but a lived-in landscape, shaped by thousands of years of human presence. The people who lived there had their own territories, their own seasonal rounds, their own relationships with the plants and animals and rivers that sustained them. They had their own stories, their own ways of understanding the world, their own solutions to the eternal human challenges of survival and meaning. All of this exists now only in fragments, a harpoon here, a piece of worked antler there, scattered across museum collections that few people ever see. The coherent world that these objects once belonged to has been atomized, reduced to individual specimens, divorced from their cultural context. We can study the tools but not the hands that made them, analyze the bones but not the lives they once supported. Modern archaeological techniques are beginning to change this, allowing researchers to reconstruct not just individual sites, but entire landscapes. Computer models based on sonar data can show us where the rivers flowed, where the forests grew, where the best hunting grounds would have been. Environmental reconstructions based on pollen samples and geological cores can tell us what the climate was like, what plants grew, what animals lived there. Slowly, painstakingly, we're learning to read the underwater archive of Doggerland, but there are limits to what science can recover. We can map the rivers, but not the names people gave them. We can identify the tools, but not the stories told around the fires where they were made. We can trace the coastlines, but not the memories of those who walked along them. The human dimension of Doggerland, the thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and dreams of its inhabitants, remains as lost as the land itself. Standing on the deck of a ferry crossing the North Sea, watching the waves roll past, it's hard to imagine that you're sailing over forests and hills, rivers and lakes, the homes and hunting grounds of people who lived and died in a world that no longer exists. The water is grey and choppy, unremarkable, giving no sign of the hidden landscape beneath. You might be passing over a Mesolithic campsite, a river crossing where families gathered for seasonal ceremonies, a hill where children learned to make their first stone tools. The fishing boats that work these waters continue to bring up artifacts from the lost world below: mammoth teeth, pieces of bog oak, stone axes, fragments of pottery from later periods, when Doggerland was becoming an island archipelago before finally disappearing altogether. Each trawl is like a lottery ticket, a chance to connect with people who lived in a world so different from ours that it might as well be another planet. Yet they were people like us, facing the same fundamental challenges of survival, meaning, and connection that all humans face. They loved their children, mourned their dead, told stories around their fires, looked up at the same stars we see. They developed technologies, created art, maintained social relationships across distances and generations. They were fully human, fully present in their world. living complete lives in a landscape that supported their needs and nurtured their communities? What if we've been living beside a forgotten civilization all along, but the only reason we forgot them is because the ground they stood on disappeared? The question echoes across the waves of the North Sea, carried on winds that once blew across forests and meadows, rivers and hills. Doggerland didn't lose a war or succumb to internal collapse. It simply sank beneath our collective memory, taking with it an entire chapter of human history that we're only now learning to read. The story of Doggerland reminds us that forgetting takes many forms. Sometimes civilizations disappear because they're conquered or collapse. Sometimes they fade because their languages die or their monuments crumble. But sometimes they vanish simply because the world changes around them in ways too large and slow for any human response. The sea rises, the land sinks, and entire ways of life slip beneath the waves, leaving only scattered traces for future archaeologists to puzzle over. In the end, perhaps that's the most humbling lesson of Doggerland, that human memory is as fragile as the landscapes we inhabit, that the earth itself can forget, and that some stories can only be told by those patient enough to listen to the whispers of mud and water, bone and stone, time and tide. We call them lost, prehistoric, unrecorded. But that's our failure, not theirs. They remembered differently. They encoded meaning in direction, in ritual, in shadow. They told stories through the way a wall curves, the way a body is buried, the way stone circles catch the sun at precisely the right moment of the year. Not in chapters, but in arrangements. Not in grammar, but in form. They didn't write history, they lived it, trusting the land to hold their memory. We only forgot them because we were taught to look for paper, for names, for signatures, for declarations. When we didn't find any, we assumed there was nothing there. But the silence wasn't absence, it was design. A deliberate choice to speak in languages that would outlast any scroll, to build meaning that couldn't be burned or banned or mistranslated by conquerors. Their calendars still mark the solstice. Their tombs still face the sky. Their stones still catch light in ways no accident could explain. Their artifacts wait in museum drawers, in hidden caves, beneath shifting rivers. They're not gone, they're speaking in frequencies we stopped learning to hear. Standing among their ruins, you begin to understand something unsettling. These civilizations didn't fail to develop writing. They chose different forms of permanence. They trusted stone over script, placement over proclamation, mystery over explanation. They built things that would endure, not because they could be read, but because they couldn't be fully understood, ensuring future generations would return again and again to puzzle over their meaning. So the question turns on us. What are we building that will outlast our words? What rituals are we performing without realizing that will become someone else's mystery? In our age of digital documents and cloud storage, of tweets and texts that vanish with the next update, are we creating anything that would survive the kind of forgetting that claimed Doggerland or Rongorongo? Perhaps we're already writing our own forgotten story, one layer of concrete at a time, one algorithm at a time, one choice at a time. Future archaeologists might puzzle over our shopping malls and highways the way we puzzle over Cahokia's earthworks or Pumapunku's precision blocks. They might wonder what we believed, what we valued, what we thought was worth preserving. Across deserts and plains, islands and seas, there's a map drawn not in ink, but in towers, circles, bones and dust. It doesn't lead to the past. It leads to a question we still don't know how to answer. What does it mean to be remembered when no one speaks your name? What does it mean to build something that will outlast your voice? The civilizations without words understood something we're still learning, that the most profound human expressions might be the ones that refuse to explain themselves, that trust future generations to feel what couldn't be written, to understand through experience what couldn't be captured in text. They built without words, but they speak to us still,